At 10:14 the next morning, police walked through my parents' backyard while a gold 3 balloon bobbed over the second day of Teddy's birthday brunch. I watched a short clip. A party guest dropped into our family group chat from my daughter's ICU room, where Cassidy still lay on a ventilator after a hit and run. Hours earlier, I had begged Mom and Dad to come say what might be goodbye. Mom texted, "We can't. Teddy's caterer is already here. Stop being dramatic." Later, Detective Ruiz confirmed officers had opened my parents' garage. Inside sat the SUV from the news with the same plate I had seen in their driveway every week for 6 years. If stories like mine mean something to you, please stay with me. It started Friday night with a phone call I almost ignored. I was standing at my kitchen counter in socks, rinsing out the travel mug I used for work, when my phone buzzed beside the sink. Cassidy had been at a school event that evening and had texted me less than half an hour earlier that she was walking home. She was 16, old enough to roll her eyes when I asked her to share her location, and young enough that I still checked anyway. The route was familiar. A few blocks of lit commercial road, then the crosswalk near the pharmacy, then our neighborhood. I remember thinking I had just enough time to throw her leftover pasta in the microwave before she came through the door, complaining that the sauce had dried out. The number on my phone was local but unfamiliar. I let it ring twice while I dried my hands. On the third ring, something inside me tightened for no reason I could name. The woman who answered my hello said she was calling from the emergency department. She asked if I was Megan Carter and whether Cassidy Carter was my daughter. After that, the words stopped arriving in sentences. There had been a collision, a vehicle, a pedestrian. My daughter had been brought in by ambulance. She was unconscious. They needed me there. I left the faucet running. I do not remember putting on shoes. I remember my keys falling between the front seat and the console because my hands would not close properly. I remember the red numbers on the dashboard clock 9:41 and the strange insult of ordinary traffic lights continuing to cycle while my daughter was somewhere ahead of me, surrounded by strangers. Every red light felt personal. I kept saying her name, out loud, as if repetition could keep her attached to the world. At the hospital entrance, a security guard pointed me toward the emergency desk. A nurse met me before I got there. She spoke carefully, the way medical people do when they know your brain is already trying to run away from what they are saying. Cassidy had been struck in a marked crosswalk. The driver had not stayed. Someone nearby had called 911. She had a serious head injury, signs of internal bleeding around the brain, and multiple fractures in her pelvis and leg. A trauma team was stabilizing her. A neurosurgeon was on the way. I heard myself ask whether Cassidy had been awake. The nurse shook her head. That was the moment the night divided into before and after. Before, Cassidy had been a 16-year-old who left damp towels on the bathroom floor, changed songs before the chorus, and stole the better half of every order of fries while insisting she was not hungry. After, she became a list of numbers on monitors and words I had never wanted to learn. Intracranial pressure, hemorrhage, ventilation, fracture pattern, consent. Because her father had died 8 years earlier, there was no second parent to call, no one to split the paperwork with, no one who knew exactly how Cassidy bit the inside of her cheek when she was scared. The hospital staff were kind, but kindness did not change the fact that every question landed on me. I signed where they told me to sign. I repeated her allergies. I gave them my insurance card. I answered the same identifying questions to different people until my own name sounded unfamiliar. The neurosurgeon arrived just after 10:30. He explained that the bleeding in Cassidy's head was creating pressure and that waiting could make the damage worse. He needed to operate. He also explained that her orthopedic injuries would matter later if they got through the immediate danger first. That word "if" was the only one I heard clearly. I called no one. That is hard to explain unless you have spent most of your life being the person everyone assumes will manage. I had parents. I had a younger brother. I had relatives whose numbers were stored in my phone. But reaching for help had never been my first reflex. My first reflex was to make a list, answer the question in front of me, and keep moving until somebody else was safe. My mother used to call that being independent. My father called me practical. I had worn both words like medals, because the alternative was admitting that sometimes independent was what people called you after they had learned they did not need to show up. I sat alone in the surgical waiting area, with Cassidy's backpack beside my chair. A hospital employee had brought it up from the emergency department. One strap was dirty, and the fabric smelled faintly like cold pavement and wet leaves. I kept one hand on it, as though it were her shoulder. At some point after midnight, I opened my family group chat. There were older messages about Teddy's birthday weekend, pictures of gold napkins, a dog-shaped cake topper, and my mother asking whether anyone thought the Sunday brunch needed a second fruit tray. Teddy was their golden doodle, and he was sweet in the uncomplicated way dogs are sweet. He had nothing to do with what was wrong in my family. That mattered to me even then. The absurdity was not that my parents loved their dog. It was the amount of care they could summon when they wanted to. The party had been planned for weeks. Saturday evening was the main event. Sunday morning was a catered brunch because, as Mom had written, if we're doing three properly. I had smiled when I first read it. Cassidy had sent me a screenshot of the invitation with 3 laughing emojis and asked whether Teddy had a retirement plan too. Sitting outside an operating room, the joke felt like something that belonged to another life. I typed, "Cassidy's been hurt." Then I deleted it. I told myself there was no point waking everyone before I knew anything. I told myself Mom would panic, Dad would ask questions I could not answer, and I needed my head clear. All of that was true. It was also true that I had been trained by years of small moments to ask whether my need was important enough before I made it someone else's problem. The memory that came back to me was not dramatic. That was probably why it had lasted. A few years after my husband died, I had moved Cassidy and me from a rental into the townhouse where we still lived. Dad had promised to help me carry the heavy furniture. He was there less than an hour before Jason called about some problem he could not solve on his own. Dad put down one end of a bookcase, checked his phone, and said he had to go. Mom, who had brought sandwiches, packed them back into the cooler and went with him. I had stared at the bookcase leaning against the wall. Jason needs us more right now, Mom had said. I remember answering, okay. That one word had become a habit. Surgery lasted through the middle of the night. When the neurosurgeon finally came out, his cap was off and there was a red line across his forehead from where it had pressed into his skin. He said they had relieved the pressure and controlled the bleeding they could see. Cassidy was being moved to intensive care. She would remain sedated and on a ventilator while they watched for swelling. The next 12 to 24 hours mattered. He did not promise me she would wake up. By dawn, the windows at the end of the ICU hallway had turned from black to a thin Minnesota gray. I had not slept. A nurse brought me coffee I forgot to drink. Every few minutes I stood beside Cassidy's bed and tried to find pieces of my daughter beneath the equipment. Her hair had been cleaned as much as possible, but there was still dried blood near the edge of a dressing. Her face looked wrong in a way I could not explain. Not unrecognizable. Worse, recognizable enough that every tube felt like an invasion. The ventilator gave a soft mechanical sigh. A monitor traced her heartbeat in green. One leg was immobilized. Her hands looked almost normal. I held one because I needed at least one part of her to feel normal. Mom's here, I whispered. I did not ask her to fight. I did not tell her she had to be strong. Cassidy had spent enough of her life hearing adults praise strength when what they really meant was endurance. I just told her where she was, and that I was there. Saturday became a collection of updates separated by waiting. The pressure in her brain was still a concern. Her blood pressure shifted. A repeat scan showed enough uncertainty that nobody used the word stable in the way I wanted them to. The orthopedic team could wait. Her brain could not. I learned how to read nurses' faces before they spoke. I learned that "we're watching closely" was not reassurance, only information. I also learned how quickly the body forgets basic things when fear takes over. By lunchtime, I realized I had not eaten since Friday afternoon. I bought crackers from a vending machine and could only swallow 2. I charged my phone from a wall outlet near the family lounge and watched messages pile up from work. I sent my supervisor one sentence, saying my daughter had been seriously injured and I would not be in. She responded that they would cover me, and I should stay with Cassidy. That simple response nearly broke me. I still had not called my parents. Around 3, I opened the family chat again. The birthday weekend had begun to appear in photographs. Gold and cream balloons were tied along my parents' deck rail. Someone had posted a picture of Teddy wearing a little blue bow tie while my mother crouched beside him laughing. Behind her, I could see white catering boxes stacked on an outdoor table. I stared at the photo longer than I should have. There was nothing wrong with the picture by itself. A woman loved her dog. A family was gathering. A caterer was setting up a party. In any other week, I might have teased Mom for treating a golden doodle like a member of the royal family. But I was looking at it from beside a bed where my child could not breathe without a machine. Even then, I did not call. That is the part I have judged myself for the most. Not because calling earlier would have changed Cassidy's injuries. It would not. But because I can see now how deeply I had accepted the idea that I should not interrupt other people's lives until I had no alternative. At 5 o'clock, Teddy's main party officially started. I knew because the family group chat filled with little notification banners across my phone. I turned the phone face down. At 6:03, the ICU doctor came in with a nurse. He pulled a chair closer, instead of speaking from the doorway. My stomach dropped before he said anything. Cassidy's latest neurological assessment had not gone the way they hoped. The doctor explained that swelling could change quickly, and that they were adjusting medication and watching her response. He was careful not to say she was dying. He was equally careful not to tell me she was safe. Then he said, "If there are close family members you want nearby, this would be a reasonable time to call them." The room seemed to tilt. I looked at Cassidy's face and thought of every ordinary thing I had not said that morning because I assumed I would get another morning. I thought about the cup she had left in the sink, the sweatshirt on the back of the dining chair, the text where she had written walking home now. "Love you" without punctuation because apparently punctuation was embarrassing at 16. For the first time since the phone rang Friday night, I stopped trying to be the person who could handle it. I picked up my phone. I called Mom first. It rang until voicemail. I called Dad. No answer. I looked at the clock beside Cassidy's bed. 6:17 p.m. Then I texted both of them. Cassidy is in the ICU after a hit and run. She had emergency brain surgery last night. The doctor says the next hours are critical and told me to call close family now. Please come. This could be your last chance to see her. The message showed delivered. I watched the screen. For almost 2 minutes, nothing happened. Then 3 dots appeared under Mom's name. They vanished. They appeared again. Her reply came through as a block of text. "We can't. Today is Teddy's birthday party, and the expensive caterer is already here. Guests are here, and tomorrow's brunch is already paid for. Stop being dramatic. Let the doctors do their jobs and update us when you know something real." I read it twice because the first time my brain rejected the order of the words. I called her immediately. She answered over music and voices. I could hear glassware, someone laughing, and then my mother saying my name with the impatient tone people use when they have stepped away from something important. "Mom, I'm not being dramatic. I need you to come. They think we could lose her." There was a pause, but not the kind I wanted. She told me they had a house full of people. The caterer was in the middle of service, and there was nothing they could do at the hospital that doctors were not already doing. Dad was there, she said. He agreed. They should wait until there was something definite. Put Dad on, I said. Another pause. Then Mom said he was busy with guests. That was all. I ended the call because I could feel my voice changing, and I did not want the last thing Cassidy heard, even sedated, to be me begging my own parents to care. For several minutes I sat in the chair beside her bed, with the phone still in my hand. I had expected panic from them. I had expected questions. I had even expected my mother to complain about the timing while she grabbed her coat. I had not expected no. It is strange what the mind does when something hurts too much. Mine started looking for excuses for them before I had even stopped shaking. Maybe Mom had misunderstood the doctor's warning. Maybe she thought critical was just standard hospital language. Maybe Dad had not heard the whole conversation. Maybe they believed I was frightened and making it sound worse than it was. Then I looked at the text again. Stop being dramatic. There was no misunderstanding in those 3 words. A notification from the family group chat slid down over the top of the screen. Someone had posted a short video from the party. I almost ignored it. Instead, I tapped. Teddy trotted across my parents' living room, wearing the same blue bow tie from the earlier photo. A gold balloon shaped like the number 3 floated behind him. People clapped while my mother carried in a dog-shaped cake on a white platter. My father appeared for a second near the patio doors, smiling at someone outside the frame. He did not look busy. I muted the video. I watched it again, without sound, and somehow that was worse. The room on my screen was warm and bright. The room around me smelled like sanitizer and plastic tubing. On the video, people lifted champagne glasses. Beside me, a machine breathed for my daughter. I set the phone down on the blanket near Cassidy's hand. I'm here, I told her again. This time the words came out broken. The doctor returned later and said her numbers had not worsened. That was not good news exactly, but it was enough to let me inhale. The nurse adjusted Cassidy's medication and dimmed the lights. Outside the windows, Saturday had gone fully dark. At 8:34, my phone buzzed with a local news alert. I nearly dismissed it. News had become background noise, something from a world where other people still worried about weather, sports, and road construction. Then I saw the words serious hit and run and teenage pedestrian. My thumb stopped. The alert linked to a short report asking for information about the vehicle that had struck a 16-year-old girl Friday night and left the scene. Police had released a still image gathered during the investigation. I opened it because I needed to know whether there was anything I could recognize. The picture was grainy and dark. An SUV moving through an intersection. Rear lights blurred. The angle was bad. For a second, it meant nothing. Then my stomach tightened. I knew that color. Not exactly. Lots of SUVs were that dark gray blue. I told myself that immediately. Then I noticed the shallow dent near the rear passenger side panel, an old mark I had seen every time Dad backed into his driveway at the wrong angle and sunlight hit it. My mouth went dry. I enlarged the photo. The image broke into pixels. I dragged it sideways and zoomed again until the plate filled as much of the screen as the resolution allowed. I had seen that plate every week for 6 years. I knew the first 3 characters before my eyes reached the rest. I looked from the phone to Cassidy, then back to the image. The SUV police were looking for belonged to my parents. For several seconds, I could not make my thumb move. The photo on my phone stayed open, while the ventilator beside Cassidy kept its steady rhythm. Dark SUV, blurred taillights, my parents' plate. I knew there were explanations that did not end with either my mother or my father behind the wheel. Someone could have borrowed the car. The image could be older than the report made it seem. I could be reading the plate wrong through compression and glare. I told myself all of that because the alternative was too large to let into the room at once. Then I looked at the timestamp on the news alert again and called my father. He did not answer. I called my mother. She picked up on the 4th ring. The music from Teddy's party was quieter now, but I could still hear voices behind her and the clink of dishes being gathered. She sounded annoyed before I had even finished saying hello, as if my second call of the evening had crossed some line of acceptable emergency. I asked where the SUV was. There was a pause long enough for me to sit straighter. "At home," she said. "Why?" I looked at Cassidy. Her eyes were closed beneath the low ICU light. "Are you sure?" Mom asked how Cassidy was doing. It was not an answer. I repeated the question. This time, I told her the police had released an image of the vehicle that hit Cassidy and that the plate looked like theirs. Another pause. Mom said she and Dad had already seen the same news still and recognized the plate as theirs, but insisted the image did not prove who had been driving. Then she said local news loved getting people worked up and that I should stop staring at my phone and let the police do their jobs. She asked again whether Cassidy's condition had changed. What struck me was not that she tried to explain it away. Anyone would want an explanation. What struck me was how little surprise I heard. No sharp inhale. No confused, "What are you talking about?" She moved around the fact as if the important thing was getting me away from it. "Put Dad on. He's cleaning up." I called him. He didn't answer. "He's busy, Megan." My hand tightened around the phone. "Mom, where is the SUV?" "I told you. It's here." The line went quiet, except for the party behind her. I asked whether Dad had driven anywhere Friday night. She said she did not know exactly what time he had gone where, then corrected herself and said he had been home. The correction came too quickly. Before I could ask what she meant, she told me she needed to go because people were still there. I did not accuse her. I did not say the sentence already forming in my head. Did Dad hit Cassidy? I could not make myself say it while my daughter lay 6 feet away. After the call ended, I saved the news image to my phone and found the number listed in the report for anyone with information. I gave my name, told the dispatcher I was Cassidy Carter's mother, and said I believed I recognized the vehicle as belonging to my parents. The person on the line did not react dramatically. She took the information, confirmed my contact number, and said an investigator would follow up. That ordinary professionalism helped. It made the moment feel less like I was accusing my own family, and more like I was giving the police something they had asked the public to give them. A detective called me less than an hour later. Her name was Elena Ruiz. Her voice was level and careful, and she did not tell me more than she needed to. She confirmed that investigators were already working with vehicle information gathered before the public image was released. She asked how long my parents had owned their SUV, who normally drove it, and whether I knew of anyone else who used it. Dad drove it most often. Mom drove it sometimes. That was what I knew. When Ruiz asked whether anyone else lived at my parents' house, I hesitated. "My brother is staying there right now," I said. She asked his name and age. I gave them to her. Then she moved on without telling me what the question meant. By the time the call ended, it was after 9:30. I stared at my parents' names in my contacts and thought about calling again. I wanted one of them to break first. I wanted Dad to call me back and sound genuinely confused. I wanted Mom to send a picture of the SUV sitting clean and untouched in the garage, with some obvious explanation for why a matching plate had appeared on the news. I wanted the whole thing to collapse into a mistake before I had to decide what it meant. Instead, Dad finally texted me. "SUV is home. Focus on Cassidy. We'll talk tomorrow." I read the message 3 times. He did not ask me to send the picture either. That night I slept for maybe 20 minutes at a time in the reclining chair beside Cassidy's bed. Each time I woke, I had the same first thought. She was still here. The second thought changed. Sometimes it was the crossing. Sometimes it was my mother's text. Sometimes it was the plate. Around 2 in the morning, one of the nurses noticed I was staring at my phone again and suggested I try to rest. I put it face down on the small table. The room was dark, except for monitor light and the glow from the hallway. Cassidy's fingers were warm in mine. Whatever was happening at my parents' house could wait until morning. Her body could not. That was the only decision I could make without hating myself. Sunday came slowly. Cassidy's numbers had held through the night. No one called it good. The swelling was still being watched, and the nurse warned me not to attach too much meaning to one stable stretch. But for the first time since Friday, I let myself believe the next hour might arrive without disaster. At 7:30, Mom texted asking whether there was anything definite yet. I did not answer immediately. Below her message, the family group chat had already started filling with pictures from the second day of Teddy's birthday weekend. The caterer had returned for brunch. Someone had photographed trays of pastries lined up on my parents' kitchen island. There were gold paper cups with paw prints on them, bowls of fruit, a small sign that said 3 years of Teddy. The same balloon arch from Saturday had survived the night. I could not understand how the house could look so normal. Maybe that sounds irrational. Of course, the tables and balloons did not know anything. The dog did not know anything. Guests who had been invited weeks earlier might not know what was happening at all. But I had spent the night listening to a ventilator breathe for my daughter, while my parents slept under the same roof as the vehicle police were searching for. At 8, Detective Ruiz called again. She told me investigators were continuing to follow the vehicle lead, and that I might see police activity at my parents' address. She was deliberate about what she did not say. She did not tell me who they believed had been driving. She did not tell me that anyone was under arrest. She explained that a vehicle connected to a serious hit and run could contain time-sensitive physical evidence, and that officers were taking legal steps to locate and preserve it. The phrase, legal steps, stayed with me. I asked whether they were sure the plate was my parents'. Ruiz said the registration information was consistent with the lead they had developed. She also said the public still image was not the beginning of their investigation. Officers had other camera and registration information before the news station ever showed it. That answered one question and opened 10 more. If the car is there, I asked, does that mean my parents are suspects? It means we need the vehicle, she said. Who was driving is a separate question. It was the closest thing to reassurance I had received, and it was not reassuring at all. I thought of Dad behind the wheel. He was the one who drove when both of my parents were in the car. He complained that Mom braked too late. He backed into parking spaces even when there was no reason to. The old dent I had recognized in the news still had happened in their own driveway after he clipped a low stone planter and refused to get it fixed because, in his words, it's a car, not a museum piece. Then I thought of Mom's keys. She kept them in the side pocket of her purse and had driven the SUV to my house plenty of times. Either one of them could have been on that road Friday night. The thought made me physically sick. At 9:40, I left Cassidy's bedside long enough to wash my face in the family restroom. When I came back, a respiratory therapist was checking the ventilator tubing. I stood out of the way and watched people care for my daughter, with the focused seriousness I had begged from my own parents. My phone buzzed at 10:14, a family group message. The thumbnail showed my parents' backyard. I opened it. The clip lasted 11 seconds. A party guest had filmed from near the sliding door. At first, all I saw was the brunch setup. White tablecloths, gold balloons, people turning their heads toward the side gate. Then 2 uniformed officers crossed the yard with another person in plain clothes behind them. The gold 3 balloon twisted in the breeze above their shoulders. Someone off camera asked what was happening. The video jerked sideways and ended. I watched it once. Then again, I did not see my parents. I did not see the garage. I did not see anyone arrested. The clip told me only what it actually showed. Police had arrived in the middle of Teddy's birthday brunch. The group chat exploded almost immediately. One cousin asked if everything was okay. Someone else wrote that officers were at the house. A third person asked whether this had something to do with the crash on the news. Then messages started disappearing as quickly as they appeared. I did not type anything. 5 minutes later, Mom called. Her voice was low and sharp. She wanted to know what I had told the police. The question landed harder than I expected. Not, how is Cassidy? Not, did they identify the driver? Not, Megan, what is happening? What did you tell the police? I told them I recognized your SUV. You should have called us first. I did. She went silent. I reminded her I had asked where the SUV was. I reminded her she had told me it was home. I asked why police had a warrant at her house, if this was all some blurry mistake. Mom said I was getting ahead of myself. She said police were looking at the vehicle because of the plate, that it did not mean anyone in the family had done anything, and that there were guests standing in their kitchen, while officers treated the house like a crime scene. There it was again. The humiliation of the party before the terror of the reason police were there. I asked if Dad was with her. He's dealing with them. Is the SUV in the garage? Another pause. Yes. My heartbeat changed. Is it damaged? She told me she did not know what the police thought they had seen. Then she said she had to go. Before she hung up, I heard Dad's voice somewhere near her, too far from the phone for me to make out the words. I stared at the screen after the call ended. I had wanted them to tell me the SUV was somewhere else. At a repair shop, loaned out to a neighbor, stolen. Anything that separated my parents' car from the dark image of the vehicle leaving Cassidy in a crosswalk. Instead, it was exactly where Mom had said it was. At home. Detective Ruiz called me just before 11. She confirmed that officers had served a search warrant connected to the suspected vehicle and the garage area where it was located. She kept the explanation plain. Investigators had linked the registration to the address, had enough supporting information to seek judicial authorization, and were now preserving the SUV for examination. Finding the car at my parents' house did not by itself establish who had been driving it. What did it look like? I asked. Ruiz paused, then said there was visible recent damage that investigators would need to compare with evidence from the crash scene. The words, recent damage, seemed to empty the air out of the room. I sat down. For a moment, all I could hear was Cassidy's ventilator and the faint squeak of a cart passing in the hallway. Are my parents being arrested? No, Ruiz said. Not because the vehicle is registered to them. I held on to that distinction even as fear kept trying to finish the story before the evidence did. Dad drove the SUV most often. Mom had access. Both had answered my questions strangely, and police had now taken it from their garage. I asked whether either of my parents had explained who used the SUV Friday night. Ruiz said investigators were still working through statements and timelines and could not give me a conclusion yet. That answer should have stopped me. It did not stop my mind. By noon, the birthday brunch was over. I knew only because the family chat had gone silent, and then restarted in a different tone. No more pastries, no more teddy pictures. People were asking whether my parents needed anything. One relative posted that police had towed the SUV. Another said the whole thing was probably a misunderstanding. Mom sent a message to the group telling everyone not to speculate. I did not reply. A little later, Dad finally called me. He sounded tired, but not frightened in the way I expected a man to sound if police had just removed the vehicle that might have nearly killed his granddaughter. He said officers had asked a lot of questions. He said they were making assumptions from a car. He said the family should let the investigation play out. I asked him one thing. Did you drive the SUV Friday night? There was a beat of silence. No. The answer came cleanly enough that something inside me loosened and tightened at the same time. Did Mom? No. I closed my eyes. Then who did? Dad said he did not know what police were going to claim. He said people came and went. Keys were in the house, and everyone needed to stop turning uncertainty into accusation. People came and went. It was the first time either of my parents had widened the circle beyond themselves. I asked what that meant. Instead of answering, Dad asked how Cassidy was. I told him she was still on a ventilator. He said he was sorry. 2 words, quietly spoken. They hurt more than I wanted them to, because I believed he meant them. Then he said he had to deal with the insurance company and ended the call. For the next hour, I sat beside Cassidy and tried to force my mind back into the room. Her nurse checked her pupils. Medication was adjusted. I listened to an explanation about what they would watch for over the next several hours. I asked questions. I wrote down answers because I no longer trusted my memory. I did not search social media. I did not drive to my parents' house. I did not try to reconstruct traffic camera routes from my phone. The police had a job. My job was the girl in the bed. But the mystery came to me anyway. At 1:26, Ruiz called once more. This time she said investigators had completed initial interviews at the house and were comparing statements about who had access to the SUV and when it had last been driven. I asked whether my parents' stories matched. She did not give me transcripts. She did not need to. She said there were timeline differences they were working to clarify. A cold feeling moved through me. What kind of differences? Ruiz told me my father had initially placed the SUV at the house after Friday afternoon. My mother's account of when it was last used was different. She would not characterize the discrepancy beyond that. I pressed my fingers against my forehead. Dad had just told me people came and went. Mom had told me the SUV was home. Neither one had said, "We know exactly who had it." The story around the vehicle was getting less solid every time one of them touched it. Then Ruiz asked me a question I had not expected. "Your brother Jason is currently staying with your parents, correct?" "Yes." "Has that been long-term?" "A few months." She asked whether he was normally at the house overnight, whether he had access to common areas, and whether I knew if the vehicle keys were kept somewhere private. I answered only what I knew. Jason had been staying there while he got back on his feet. My parents did not keep household keys in a safe. Dad usually left vehicle keys on a small tray near the mudroom entrance, unless Mom had them in her purse. Ruiz thanked me. I waited for her to say more. She did not. "Why are you asking about Jason?" A brief pause. "Because we're identifying everyone who could reasonably have had access to the vehicle. That was all. No accusation, no reveal, just another door opening." After the call, I sat very still. Jason had not been the first person I thought of, because Jason had always existed in a separate category in my mind. My younger brother was the person my parents worried about, rescued, housed, explained. He was the one with the unfinished plans and sudden emergencies. But none of that meant he had been driving Friday night. None of it meant anything yet. I refused to build a crime out of family history. Still, a memory surfaced from Saturday's call. Mom saying people were still at the house. Dad being busy. Her careful insistence that the SUV was home. Neither of them volunteering that Jason was there. My phone lit up with a new message from Mom. "Please do not drag your brother into this. He's had a terrible night too." I read the sentence twice. I had never mentioned Jason to her. Not once. The ICU suddenly felt too warm. Before I could decide whether to answer, Ruiz sent a brief follow-up asking me to call if I remembered anything else about access to the SUV. I called instead of texting. "I need to ask you something," I said. "Did my parents mention Jason before you asked about him?" Ruiz did not answer the question directly. She said the investigation was still active, and she did not want to shape my recollection with information from other interviews. It was a fair answer. It was also enough to make my pulse jump. Then she gave me one piece of information she could share. Besides Bob and Linda, there was another adult resident of the house who regularly had access to the area where the keys were kept. My brother. I looked at Cassidy beneath the hospital blanket, at the bruising beginning to darken along the side of her face, at the machine moving air into her lungs. The question I had been asking since the night before changed shape. It was no longer only whether my mother or father had been driving. It was how many people in that house could have taken their SUV on Friday night, and why my parents' story about it had started shifting the moment police came through the gate. Ruiz's last words stayed with me after the call ended. Your brother had access to the keys. Your brother had access to the keys. I kept hearing Detective Ruiz say it after the call ended. Not your brother was driving. Not we know what happened. Just access. One ordinary word, the kind that belonged in conversations about spare bedrooms and grocery runs, suddenly connected Jason to the same set of keys that could have put my parents' SUV in the crosswalk with Cassidy. I stared at my daughter and tried not to let my mind run ahead of the evidence. Cassidy had not moved except for the small involuntary shifts the nurses had warned me about. Her face was still swollen. A strip of tape held one line against her cheek, and the ventilator continued its measured rise and fall. I could not decide whether knowing my brother might be part of this was worse than believing one of my parents had been driving. Jason was 37. He had held Cassidy when she was a baby. He had taught her how to throw a spiral in my parents' backyard, and once spent 40 minutes helping her build a lopsided snow fort because she refused to accept that Minnesota snow did not always cooperate with architectural ambition. He had been careless with his own life in ways I did not understand. He had not been a stranger to my daughter. That memory made the possibility harder, not easier. Sunday afternoon turned into another stretch of waiting, but the waiting had changed. Before, I had been waiting for medical numbers to move in the right direction. Now, every vibration from my phone threatened to rearrange my family. I stopped checking the group chat. I stopped rereading Mom's message about not dragging Jason into it. When a nurse asked if I wanted a sandwich from the family refrigerator, I said yes, even though I was not hungry. I ate half of it because the nurse stood there until I took the first bite, then pretended not to notice when I put the rest down. The hospital had become a place where strangers quietly insisted that I remain a functioning human being, while the people who had raised me seemed determined to make that harder. Ruiz did not call again that evening. Neither did my parents. I expected that silence to feel like relief. Instead, it felt staged, as if all of us were standing in different rooms, waiting for someone else to say the sentence that would make denial impossible. On Monday morning, Cassidy's neurosurgeon told me the swelling had not worsened overnight. Her intracranial pressure was still being watched, and he would not predict when they could reduce sedation, but he used the phrase cautiously encouraging. I repeated those two words to myself until they lost their shape. The orthopedic injuries still waited in the background. Her pelvis and leg would require their own plan, when her brain was ready for the rest of her body to become the emergency. For the first time since Friday, the doctors were talking about what might come next, instead of only whether there would be a next. I should have felt hope cleanly. I did not. Hope arrived tangled with dread. Ruiz called a little after 10. She asked whether I had a few minutes to talk away from the bedside. I stepped into the family lounge, but stayed where I could see the ICU doors. She told me investigators had spent Sunday and early Monday comparing several kinds of information: the condition of the SUV, camera images from more than one location, and phone location timing they had lawfully obtained or were in the process of confirming. She did not give me a dramatic play-by-play. What she gave me was worse because it was careful. The vehicle evidence was consistent with the SUV being involved in the collision. A sequence of cameras placed that SUV away from my parents' address, Friday night, and along the general route that included the area near Cassidy's crosswalk. And the timeline they were building placed Jason with the vehicle during that period. I pressed my shoulder against the wall. You're saying he drove it? Ruiz paused before answering. The evidence is pointing strongly in that direction. Pointing strongly was not the same as a conviction. It was not even the same as a formal charge. But it was enough to make my knees feel unreliable. I sat in one of the lounge chairs and stared at the carpet. The pattern in it was blue and gray, designed to hide stains. I remember that because my brain needed somewhere harmless to go. I asked whether Jason had admitted anything. Ruiz said he had counsel, and that she could not walk me through every statement. She did tell me that investigators were no longer treating the question of who had driven as equally open among everyone at the house. Jason had acknowledged being in the SUV Friday night. His version was that there had been an impact, he had panicked, and he had not known the person struck was Cassidy. The room around me went very quiet. It was not a confession in the dramatic sense. He had not called me sobbing. He had not stood at Cassidy's bedside begging forgiveness. He had not said her name into the same silence, where I had been begging my parents to come. His story, as Ruiz related in broad terms, was smaller than what had happened. He had hit something. He had panicked. He had not known something. My daughter had spent 2 nights on a ventilator, and my brother's first language for the collision had room to make her an object. I asked the question I hated myself for needing answered. Did he know he hit a person? Ruiz said that was still part of what investigators were sorting out, and she did not want to give me an answer that outran the evidence. I accepted that because I had no choice. I was beginning to understand that an investigation moved in a completely different rhythm from grief. Grief wanted one clean sentence immediately. Evidence arrived in pieces and demanded patience from people whose lives had already been torn open. After we hung up, I stayed in the lounge for another minute. Jason had been the fun uncle. That phrase sounds cheap when I say it now, but it was true. He remembered what kind of sour candy Cassidy liked. When she was 10, he had given her a ridiculous plastic trophy after she beat him at mini golf, because he said every family needed more ceremonies for useless achievements. The trophy still sat on a shelf in her room. He had been the person who could make her laugh when every other adult was asking about grades or homework. When my husband died, Jason had shown up with takeout and sat on our kitchen floor with Cassidy because she did not want to eat at the table where her father's chair was still empty. None of that changed Friday night. That was what made my feelings so ugly. I wanted the man from those memories to exist strongly enough to cancel out the man who drove away. But memories do not have that kind of power. Love is not evidence of innocence. History is not a defense against what somebody does next. When I returned to Cassidy's room, a nurse was moistening her lips with a sponge. I watched the nurse finish, then took the chair beside the bed. I did not tell Cassidy what I had learned. She was still too deeply sedated for anyone to know what she could process, and I refused to make her body carry family chaos on top of everything else. I told her the doctors were seeing some signs they liked. I told her it was Monday. I told her I had watered the little plant in her bedroom before the accident because she had forgotten again. Ordinary facts felt more merciful than names. A few hours later, one of the doctors explained that they might begin easing some sedation if her neurological signs continued moving in the right direction. He warned me that waking after a brain injury was not like waking from sleep. There could be confusion, agitation, delayed responses, or no meaningful response at first. He said not to measure recovery in movie moments. I was grateful for the bluntness. I had no room left for false comfort. My phone buzzed while he was still in the room. I did not look until he left. It was Mom. She wrote that Jason had a lawyer now, that everything was being blown out of proportion, and that I needed to remember no one had intended for Cassidy to get hurt. I read the message without answering. The sentence did not deny that Jason had been driving. That was the first time my mother had allowed the possibility to sit in plain sight without covering it with uncertainty. I called Dad instead. He answered quickly. I asked him directly whether Jason had taken the SUV Friday night. Dad said the lawyers had told everyone not to discuss details. I told him I was not everyone. I was Cassidy's mother. He exhaled into the phone, and the sound made me picture him sitting at the kitchen table with one hand over his eyes. He said yes, Jason had used the SUV. He said Jason had not set out to hurt anyone. He said people panic. He said the investigation would show what happened. I listened until he ran out of safe phrases. Then I asked why Jason had the keys at all. Dad went quiet. That silence planted something in me before I understood what it was. Later that afternoon, Ruiz called with another piece of information. She asked whether I knew Jason's driving status. I almost laughed, because the question seemed strangely small compared with everything else. I said I knew he had had tickets before, and that my parents had complained about his insurance, but I had never paid close attention. Jason's problems had always arrived in family conversations as weather, something happening around us that everyone was expected to adjust to. Ruiz told me his driver's license was suspended. I asked her to repeat it. Suspended. Not expired. Not restricted to certain hours. Suspended. She did not turn it into a lecture. She explained only what mattered for me to understand. He was not legally allowed to be driving as though nothing had happened. The exact reasons and the legal consequences would be handled through the case. What mattered in that moment was simple enough that I did not need a statute number. Jason should not have been behind the wheel Friday night. I sat down so quickly the plastic chair scraped the floor. A memory came back with painful clarity. 3 months earlier, Dad had called me on a Tuesday evening while I was making dinner. He had been irritated because Jason needed a ride somewhere the following morning. Dad had said, almost under his breath, "Jason can't drive right now until he gets this mess straightened out." At the time, I had assumed it was temporary paperwork, or one more consequence from the tickets I knew he collected too easily. I had not asked. Why would I? Jason was 37. Dad was the one telling me about it. I had no reason to imagine my parents would still hand him a set of keys. Then another memory surfaced. Mom had texted me a few weeks after that, asking whether I could take Jason to an appointment because he still can't drive himself. I had said no because I was working. Mom had sent back a thumbs up and found another solution. Those were not hidden facts. They were ordinary family messages. That made them worse. My parents knew. Not about the crash. I did not know that yet. I forced myself to stay precise, even inside my own anger. I had no evidence that they knew what Jason had done before police started asking questions. But they had known he was not legally supposed to drive, and somehow the SUV had still been available to him Friday night. I called Mom again. I asked whether she knew Jason's license was suspended. She said of course she knew. Her tone carried irritation, as if I had asked whether she knew his birthday. I asked why he had been allowed to drive their SUV. Her answer came slowly, wrapped in the kind of logic that sounds reasonable if you keep it far enough away from the consequences. Jason was trying to get back on his feet. He had a warehouse temp job. The bus schedule did not always line up with his shifts. Ride shares cost too much. Dad could not always drive him. Mom hated driving before dawn. So sometimes, if it was necessary, they let him use the SUV for work or something important. Not all the time, just when he needed it. I stared through the ICU glass at the nurses moving around Cassidy's bed. His license was suspended, I said. Mom told me I did not understand the situation. She said if Jason lost the job, he would have no income and no way to move out. Then he would be more dependent on them, not less. They had been trying to help him become independent. The word independent landed differently when she used it for him. I had spent most of my adult life being called independent because nobody had to rearrange anything for me. Jason was being taught independence by having the rules rearranged around him. I did not say that yet. I was too tired, and Cassidy still had tubes running through her body. I asked one more question. Did Dad know you were letting him drive? Mom gave a small, offended laugh. We both knew, Megan. It wasn't some secret. I closed my eyes. There was something almost relieving in that answer because it removed one kind of mystery. My parents were not accusing each other. One had not secretly undermined the other. They had made the decision together. They had looked at Jason's suspension, looked at his job, looked at their convenience, and decided the rule could bend because his need felt urgent enough. I ended the call without yelling. I did not have the strength for yelling. and anger felt too clean for what I was carrying. I felt grief, disgust, confusion, and the old reflex to understand them all at once. I knew what Dad's reasoning would be before I heard it. Without the job, Jason would spiral. Without transportation, he would lose the job. Therefore, the car was part of helping him stabilize. Each sentence could be true on its own. Put together, they had placed him behind a wheel he had no legal right to use. By Tuesday morning, investigators had enough convergence that Ruiz stopped speaking as if Jason were simply one of several possible drivers. She still did not tell me every detail, but she explained the broad picture. Vehicle evidence supported the SUV's involvement. More than one camera helped establish its movement. The timing of Jason's phone and movements aligned with that route. His own account acknowledged he had driven and that there had been a collision. No single piece was a magic answer. Together, they formed something solid enough that even my parents had stopped pretending the driver could be anyone. I asked what would happen next. Ruiz told me the case would move through the normal legal process and that other questions were still being examined. I did not press for more. I had learned enough to understand that Jason drove did not answer everything. It only changed the mystery. Cassidy remained the reason I cared about any of it. That afternoon, a nurse told me her response to stimulation had improved slightly. Slightly became the biggest word in my life. The sedation was being adjusted carefully. Her breathing was still supported, but the room no longer felt exactly as it had on Saturday. I stood by the bed and smoothed the strand of hair away from her forehead. I told her she had nowhere to be except here. No school, no homework, no obligation to make anybody feel better. She could take as long as she needed. Then I looked at her leg, immobilized beneath the blanket, and thought about the phrase my parents had used for years whenever Jason needed rescuing. He needs us more right now. I had believed that sentence meant compassion. Maybe sometimes it had. But compassion without a stopping point had become permission. Jason lost a job, they covered a bill. Jason needed a place, they gave him a room. Jason could not drive. They gave him a car when the bus was inconvenient. Each decision had been small enough to defend while it was happening. I had never thought of them as connected, because none of them had belonged to me. Now one of them belonged to Cassidy's body. Dad called that evening. For once, he did not begin by telling me to calm down. He said he knew I had spoken to Mom. He repeated the practical explanation, almost exactly as I had predicted. Jason's temp job was his best chance to get steady again. Their house was too far from the warehouse for a reliable bus route at certain shift times. They had limited the SUV use to what they considered necessary. Dad said they were not irresponsible people. I asked him whether Jason's license had somehow become valid on work days. Dad did not answer. I asked how often Jason had driven the SUV. Dad said it was not frequent. I asked whether Jason had the keys Friday. He said investigators were still sorting out timing. The sentence irritated me because we both knew that question was no longer abstract. Jason had driven. The only question was how the keys had ended up with him. Dad told me I was trying to turn every decision they had ever made into part of one tragedy. I looked at Cassidy through the glass while he said it. Maybe he was right about one thing. Not every decision belonged to Friday night. I was not going to invent a straight line where none existed. My parents had not caused every bad thing Jason had ever done. They had not placed Cassidy in the crosswalk. They had not pressed his foot to the accelerator. But they had known he was not supposed to drive, and they had decided his inconvenience mattered more than that boundary. That fact was no longer interpretation. After the call, I scrolled back through older messages on my phone, not looking for a hidden confession, only trying to remember what I had already known, without realizing it mattered. There was Mom's request that I drive Jason, because he could not legally take himself. There was Dad complaining about the suspension. There were ordinary references to early warehouse shifts and rides. Nothing secret, nothing cinematic, just pieces of family life that had never seemed important enough to connect. I stopped scrolling when I reached a message from Dad from late summer. Jason can't drive right now. Don't let him talk you into lending him your car. I read it once, then again. My father had warned me not to let Jason borrow my car. Yet by Friday night, Jason had been driving theirs. I set the phone beside Cassidy's hand and stared at the dark screen until I could see my own reflection in it. The mystery was no longer why my brother had access to the keys in some vague household sense. My parents had kept that access possible even after they knew he was suspended. I could still hear Dad's voice from months earlier, casual and certain. Jason can't drive right now. But Friday night, the SUV keys had still ended up in Jason's hands. Cassidy opened her eyes on Wednesday morning. Not all the way. Not like a movie, where someone wakes after a terrible injury and instantly recognizes the room, asks what happened, and starts becoming herself again. Her eyelids lifted halfway, unfocused and heavy, then closed. A nurse said her name and asked her to squeeze a hand. Nothing happened. A few minutes later, when the nurse repeated the request, Cassidy's fingers moved against mine so faintly I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. The nurse did not celebrate. She simply nodded, marked something on a chart, and told me that small responses counted. I had learned enough by then to understand that restraint was a kind of kindness. Nobody promised what the next response would be. Nobody told me we were past the danger. The swelling in Cassidy's brain still had to be watched. Her body had been through surgery, sedation, and trauma. Her pelvis and leg fractures remained waiting problems. The kind doctors could address only after the more urgent threat stopped changing by the hour. Still, I bent over her hand and cried so quietly. I hoped she could not hear me. Later that morning, they reduced sedation a little more. Cassidy's eyes opened again. This time, they found my face for maybe 2 seconds. Her brow pulled together. She tried to move, then flinched as pain and restraints and tubes reminded her body that it was not free to do what it wanted. The ventilator made speaking impossible. Her breathing quickened. The nurse stepped in, explaining where she was and telling her not to fight the tube. I put my hand where Cassidy could see it. "Mom's here." Her eyes moved toward me. They were frightened. I had spent days asking for her to wake up. The first thing waking gave her was fear. That was when survival stopped feeling like a finish line and started feeling like the entrance to something much longer. Over the next day, awareness came in fragments. Cassidy could follow a simple command one moment and drift away the next. She frowned at lights. She startled when a metal cart squealed in the hallway. Once, a delivery truck outside released its air brakes with a sudden hiss, and her whole upper body tensed before the nurse steadied her. I watched her eyes search the room without understanding what had scared her. I did not ask what she remembered. The police had questions. The doctors had assessments. Everyone around us had something they needed from Cassidy's mind or body. I decided I would not add myself to that list. When she was alert enough to know me, I told her only what she needed. She had been hurt. She was in the hospital. She had surgery. I was there. The rest could wait until her brain and body were ready to carry it. The ventilator came out only after the medical team was satisfied she could protect her airway and breathe well enough on her own. Even then, her first sounds were barely sounds at all. Her throat hurt. Her voice was rough and thin. When she tried to ask for water, the nurse had to explain why she could only have her mouth moistened at first. Cassidy looked offended by that in a way that was so completely 16 that I almost laughed. "You're giving me attitude," I whispered. Her eyelids lowered. The corner of her mouth moved a fraction. It was not a smile exactly, but it was close enough that I carried it for the rest of the day. The investigation did not pause while Cassidy woke. Jason was no longer a possibility. He was the driver. The evidence had tightened around that fact from more than one direction, and his own account had put him in the SUV. His license had been suspended. Mom and Dad had known. They had still treated driving as something that could be allowed when his needs seemed important enough. For the first time in my life, I began looking backward without automatically smoothing the edges. Not every memory became sinister. Most did not. My parents had loved both of us in their own ways. They had shown up for birthdays, graduations, illnesses, holidays. Dad had taught me to change a tire in the high school parking lot. Mom had sat with me for hours after my husband died, because I could not face going through his clothes. They were not cartoon villains who had spent 30 years plotting to ruin my life. That almost made it harder, because the pattern I was seeing had been built out of ordinary choices that had each sounded reasonable at the time. Jason lost a job in his late 20s after missing too many shifts. Mom and Dad paid his rent for 3 months because an eviction would set him back even further. When he borrowed money from Dad and did not repay it, nobody called it a debt after a while. Dad said there was no point making family keep score. When Jason got into trouble over driving years later, the story inside our family became about insurance rates, paperwork, and how unlucky he was that one bad stretch had followed another. I remembered the way Mom told those stories. She rarely started with what Jason had done. She started with what was happening to him. He was going to lose the apartment, the job, the ride to work. He was going to feel humiliated. The subject of the sentence was always the consequence, as if consequences were weather systems that had simply formed over his head. I had not challenged it, because most of those problems did not touch my life directly. Sometimes Mom asked me for a ride. Sometimes Dad canceled something with me. Sometimes family plans bent around Jason. I rolled my eyes, complained privately, then got on with things. I had been busy raising Cassidy, working, paying a mortgage, surviving widowhood, and trying not to need more from anyone than they were willing to give. I had mistaken distance for neutrality. Now Cassidy's fractured pelvis turned every old excuse into something physical. On Thursday morning, a physical medicine doctor came by to talk about what recovery might eventually involve. It was early. Cassidy was awake only in short stretches, still confused by time, and exhausted after simple interactions. The doctor explained that once she was medically stable enough, rehabilitation would likely involve more than one kind of work. Her leg and pelvis would limit movement. Her brain injury could affect attention, memory, balance, mood, and endurance in ways nobody could map perfectly yet. I wrote everything down. Cassidy slept through most of it. After the doctor left, Dad called. I had not spoken to him since learning that both he and Mom knew Jason's license was suspended and still let him use the SUV. I almost let the call go to voicemail. Then I looked at Cassidy and answered. Dad began by asking how she was. For once, I gave him a real answer. I told him she had opened her eyes. I told him the ventilator was out. I told him the doctors were starting to talk about rehabilitation. He sounded relieved. I believed that relief was genuine. Then I asked him why. He did not pretend not to understand. He gave me the same logic I had already heard, only more carefully arranged. Jason's temp job had been one of the few things going right. Losing it would have meant losing income. Losing income would have meant staying in their house longer. The bus did not line up with every shift. Dad said he had tried driving him when he could, but there were days when schedules did not work. They had not given Jason free use of the SUV, he insisted. They had made exceptions for what they considered essential. Work, he said. Appointments. Things that actually mattered. I looked at Cassidy's bruised face. His license was suspended. Dad said he knew that. That calm acknowledgement hurt more than an excuse would have. I asked why knowing had not ended the discussion. He said because life was not as simple as a rule written on paper. He said adults still had to work, eat, pay bills, and get themselves back on their feet. He said they had been trying to reduce Jason's dependence on them. There was that phrase again. Get back on his feet. Cassidy's own feet were going to require months of work before anyone knew how confidently she could use them again. I did not say that. I did not need to turn her injury into a line that won an argument. Instead, I said, helping him can't mean making the risk belong to somebody else. Dad went quiet. It was the first time I had said the idea out loud. Not rules, not punishment, risk. When Jason drove, he was not only risking himself, he was putting everyone on the road inside a decision Mom and Dad had helped make easier for him. Dad told me I was talking like they had handed Jason the keys and told him to go hurt someone. I said I had never claimed that. I knew the crash was not intentional. I knew they had not chosen Cassidy as a target. But intention did not erase the decision that came before it. He said they were trying to help their son. So was I said. Every time I said okay. The words surprised me as soon as they came out. Dad did not ask what I meant. Maybe he knew. For years, every time my parents rearranged something around Jason, I helped by not resisting. I helped by accepting the canceled plan, covering the inconvenience, telling myself they had good hearts and he had bad luck. None of that made me responsible for Friday night. I was not going to take on guilt that did not belong to me, but I could see now how a family system survives. It survives because the people who are not being rescued agree to absorb the disruption quietly. Dad ended the call by saying this was not the time to relitigate 30 years of family history. He was right about one thing. Cassidy needed me in the present. But the present was exactly what had made the history visible. Mom called that evening. She was more emotional than Dad, and less interested in definitions. She said Jason was falling apart. She said he was barely sleeping, and terrified about what would happen. She said I could be angry without rewriting everything they had ever done for him as a mistake. I listened. Then I asked whether she still believed letting him use the SUV had been helping. Her answer came instantly. We were helping him stand up, Megan. I looked across the room at Cassidy, asleep beneath a hospital blanket. Mom kept talking. She said they could not have known a terrible accident would happen. She said thousands of families helped adult children through hard periods. She said I was treating them like criminals for trying to keep Jason employed. I did not call them criminals. I did not know enough to say what legal responsibility, if any, their decision created. That was for lawyers and investigators. But my relationship with them did not need a statute. Before it could change, I told Mom that Cassidy's body was now carrying the cost of one of those hard periods. She said that was cruel. The accusation nearly worked because I had spent most of my life trying not to be cruel. I had confused gentleness with making every truth easier for other people to hear. I had swallowed irritation because Jason was struggling. I had forgiven before anyone asked because Mom looked tired. I had let Dad call me practical, when what he often meant was convenient. For the first time, I let the discomfort stay where it belonged. I'm not saying you wanted this, I told her. I'm saying you knew he wasn't supposed to drive, and you made exceptions anyway. Mom said there was a difference between making a bad judgment call and causing what happened to Cassidy. I agreed. That stopped her for a second. I did not need to make them responsible for everything in order to hold them responsible for something. The next day, Cassidy was awake longer. She still tired quickly, and her sense of time was unreliable. She asked me twice whether it was morning when it was nearly 4 in the afternoon. She wanted her phone, then looked confused when I told her it had been damaged in the crash, and we could replace it later. She asked why her leg hurt. I explained that it had been broken, and that doctors were taking care of it. She did not ask who hit her. I did not volunteer the answer. At one point, a nurse dropped a metal instrument tray in the hallway. The sound was sharp and sudden. Cassidy jerked, grabbed my wrist, and stared toward the door with panic, flooding her face before she seemed to understand she was safe. I waited until her breathing slowed. You don't have to remember anything right now, I said. Her eyes found mine. Did I do something? She whispered. The question went straight through me. No. That answer I gave without hesitation. You didn't do anything wrong. She closed her eyes again. I sat beside her long after she fell asleep, furious at a world where a 16-year-old could wake from being hit by a car and wonder whether the first thing she needed to understand was what she had done. I promised myself I would not let anyone turn her recovery into an investigation she had to solve for us. Detective Ruiz respected that. When she called later, she asked first whether Cassidy was medically able to participate in anything, and accepted my answer that doctors did not want unnecessary stress. Ruiz said they could wait. The case did not depend on Cassidy producing a perfect memory. Then she asked whether I had spoken to my parents about Jason's access to the SUV. I said yes. I told her the broad truth. Both of them admitted they had allowed occasional driving for work or essential errands, even while his license was suspended. I did not yet offer every old text or family memory. Ruiz did not ask me to empty my whole history into the phone. She simply noted what I said and told me investigators were continuing to build the timeline. The phrase "build the timeline" stayed with me, because my parents were building one too. By Friday, their story had settled into a shape they both repeated. Jason had made a terrible decision. They had not known the SUV was connected to Cassidy's crash until the media image and police attention made it clear. Before that, whatever Jason had said or done had not given them enough information to understand what had happened. They insisted they had not knowingly sat through Teddy's birthday party, while understanding that their son might have put their granddaughter in the ICU. That distinction mattered to me more than I wanted it to. If they were telling the truth, I still had plenty to be angry about. They had knowingly let Jason drive while suspended. They had refused to come to the ICU because a dog party mattered more to them than my fear. They had minimized and protected him almost immediately once the investigation reached their door. But if they truly had not known anything serious before the police came, then one part of what had happened remained smaller than my worst suspicion. I found myself wanting that version to be true, not because it repaired the relationship. It did not. But because I needed to believe there was still one line they had not crossed. Dad said Jason had not told them anything meaningful before the police showed up. Mom said he had been upset, but that Jason was often upset, and nothing about his behavior had told them there had been a hit and run involving a person. They said they had no reason to connect my 6:17 message about Cassidy to anything Jason had done. The wording was careful. I noticed that. Still, careful wording was not proof of a lie. For several days, I lived inside that uncertainty, while Cassidy slowly came back to herself in uneven pieces. A speech therapist asked her simple orientation questions. A physical therapist explained that movement would be limited at first because of her fractures. She complained that hospital socks were offensive, then forgot she had said it 20 minutes later. The first time she managed half a bowl of soup, she looked exhausted afterward, as if she had run miles. One afternoon, I brushed her hair carefully around the healing area near her surgical site. She hated the tangles and told me I was doing it wrong. "Good," I said. "You're complaining. That feels useful." She rolled her eyes. I almost cried again. Warmth had become dangerous, because every ordinary gesture reminded me how close I had come to losing the person who made those gestures ordinary. That evening, after Cassidy fell asleep, I thought about the family version of Jason's life with less anger than I expected. There had always been a reason for the next rescue. Mom and Dad had not woken up one day and decided consequences should not apply to him. They had made one compassionate exception, then another, then one more, because the previous exception had created a new problem that also needed solving. Rent became transportation. Transportation became employment. Employment became stability. Stability became a reason to overlook the rule that was supposed to stop him from driving. Every rescue had a good intention attached to it. That was the most frightening part. On Saturday afternoon, a full week after the crash, Ruiz called while Cassidy was asleep. Her tone was slightly different, still measured, but more focused. She said investigators had spoken to someone who had been at my parents' property before Teddy's main birthday party began. At first, I assumed she meant a guest. Then, Ruiz said the person was the catering supervisor. I actually looked at the phone as if I had misheard her. The caterer? Her name was Tanya Brooks. She had been at my parents' house during setup, hours before the party officially started. Ruiz said Tanya had provided a timeline observation that investigators were comparing against statements from my family. I felt the old tightness return to my chest. What observation? Ruiz did not give me the whole account. She said there were still interviews to complete, and she did not want me filling gaps with assumptions. I understood the rule by then. Evidence first, interpretation later. But before ending the call, she gave me one fact. Miss Brooks saw your brother beside the damaged SUV during setup before your 6:17 call. I did not answer. My eyes went to the phone where Mom's original message was still preserved in our thread. The timestamp sat above it like a nail driven into wood. The number stayed on my screen long after Detective Ruiz ended the call. I had spent a week treating that timestamp like the moment my parents failed me. Before it, I had been alone with Cassidy because I had not yet asked them to come. After it, I had asked plainly, desperately, and they had chosen the party anyway. That was already painful enough. But Tanya Brooks had just pushed another fact backward across the line. Jason had been standing beside the damaged SUV during setup, hours before I sent the message that told Mom and Dad Cassidy was in the ICU after a hit and run. I forced myself not to finish the story before Ruiz did. Seeing Jason near the SUV was not the same as hearing him confess. My parents could have believed he had clipped a post or hit a deer or backed into something. A broken headlight did not come with a label explaining what had happened. I repeated those possibilities to myself because precision mattered. Anger did not give me permission to invent what they knew. But precision worked both ways. If Tanya's timeline was accurate, then my parents' claim that there had been nothing meaningful to notice before the police arrived was already weaker than they had let me believe. Cassidy stirred in the bed beside me. She opened her eyes, looked at the ceiling, then toward me. Her attention still came and went quickly, but the moments when she recognized me were lasting a little longer. I put my phone face down before she could see my expression. "Hey," I said. Her voice was soft and rough. "You look mad." "I'm tired." She watched me for another second, then let her eyes close. I hated how easy the half-truth came. I had spent days promising myself that Cassidy would not carry adult chaos before she was ready. Keeping that promise now meant swallowing a question so large it felt physical. What did my parents know before 6:17? Ruiz called again early that evening. She said investigators had completed another interview with Tanya and could give me a little more context because Tanya's account was being used to test the family timeline, not because she had somehow solved the case. I appreciated the distinction. By then, I had learned to fear any detail that arrived too neatly. Tanya had reached my parents' property around 2:30 Saturday afternoon with 2 other catering employees. The service path they used ran along the side of the garage toward the backyard. She remembered the SUV because she had to maneuver a cart around the front corner of it while unloading insulated containers. One headlight was damaged. There was fresh-looking damage along the front passenger side that did not match the older dent near the rear panel I had recognized in the news image. Tanya had noticed because the car sat partly in the way and because Dad came outside almost immediately when the catering crew got near it. She had also seen Jason, not arriving in the SUV. Tanya was clear about that. She had not watched him drive into the property and could not say when the vehicle came home. Jason was simply there beside it when she began unloading. Dad was with him. Their conversation stopped when one of the workers came closer. That alone did not prove my parents knew Jason had hit a person. Ruiz said that before I could ask. "I understand," I told her, but Tanya had remembered something else. During a later trip from the catering van, she saw Dad lower the garage door while Jason and Mom were still near the opening. Tanya was close enough to hear only pieces of what they were saying. She could not reconstruct a full conversation, and Ruiz would not let me treat her memory like a recording. But the fragment Tanya remembered was not about a mailbox or a deer. Jason had said, "I hit somebody." Or, Tanya admitted, it might have been, "I think I hit somebody." She was certain about somebody. She was less certain about the words around it. A few seconds later, she heard Jason say that someone had come out of nowhere. Then Mom, quieter, said something close to, "We'll figure it out." Tanya had kept walking. She was there to run a catering setup, not insert herself into a family argument. She did not know who Jason was. She did not know Cassidy. She did not know there had been a hit and run the night before. At that point, none of those words meant what they meant a week later. To me, they changed the room. I sat down on the narrow couch beneath the hospital window. Outside, early October light was fading across the parking structure. The glass reflected my face over the rows of cars below. "Are you sure that was before the party started?" I asked. Ruiz said Tanya's arrival time was supported by the catering company's schedule and by the work they had been hired to do before the 5 o'clock event. Her estimate put the garage conversation sometime between roughly 2:30 and 3 hours before my text. 3 hours before I told my parents Cassidy had been struck by a driver who left the scene. 3 hours before Mom told me the caterer was already there and I was being dramatic. I pressed the heel of my hand against my forehead. There was still one fact I refused to change. At 2:30 Saturday afternoon, Mom and Dad did not know the person Jason had hit was Cassidy. Nothing Tanya heard included Cassidy's name. Nothing established that Jason himself knew who he had struck. He had spent the night saying he panicked and did not know. But Mom and Dad had known something far more serious than Jason seemed upset. They had seen their damaged SUV. They had known his license was suspended. They had heard him say he had hit somebody. That was not certainty about Cassidy. It was enough to make my 6:17 message impossible to receive as an ordinary family emergency unrelated to Jason. After I hung up, I opened the original text thread again. I did not need to search. I knew the message by heart now. Cassidy is in the ICU after a hit and run. She had emergency brain surgery last night. The doctor says the next hours are critical and told me to call close family now. Please come. This could be your last chance to see her. There was no vague wording. I had written hit and run. I had told them when Cassidy was hurt. They knew Jason had been out in their SUV Friday night. By Saturday afternoon they had heard him say he hit somebody. Then, at 6:17, their daughter told them their granddaughter had been struck by a driver who fled. I could not prove what thought crossed either of their minds when they read it. I no longer needed to. If those two facts arrived in the same hour of your life, any reasonable person would at least ask the next question. Where did it happen? What time? What road? Was Jason there? They had asked none of those things. Mom had asked for something real. Dad had been too busy with guests to come to the phone. For the first time since the crash, the dog party changed shape in my memory. Until then, I had seen it as proof that my parents could prioritize something trivial over something devastating. That was cruel enough. Now I saw another possibility underneath it. The party had not only been something they chose, instead of Cassidy, it had also been a structure they could keep moving inside while they delayed facing what Jason might have done. Guests were arriving. Food was being served. Teddy had a bow tie. Music was playing. There was always one more task that made wait feel reasonable for another 5 minutes. And waiting had always been the family's favorite way to soften Jason's consequences. I did not call my parents immediately. The urge was almost unbearable, but Cassidy woke again and needed help adjusting the position of her leg. A nurse came in to check her pain level. Cassidy tried to answer a simple question about whether the pain was sharp or aching, and became frustrated when she could not decide which word fit. Her face tightened. Tears appeared before she seemed to understand why. I put both hands around hers. "You don't have to get it right," I said. The nurse waited without rushing her. Eventually Cassidy whispered, "Both." The nurse adjusted her medication and dimmed the lights. 10 minutes later, Cassidy slept. That small scene steadied me. In Cassidy's room, uncertainty was allowed to remain uncertainty. Nobody pretended not knowing the exact word meant nothing was wrong. Nobody said that because they could not be 100% sure, they were free to ignore the risk. They responded to what they knew, watched carefully, and protected the person who could be harmed. My parents had made uncertainty do the opposite. They had used it as permission to keep going. I called Dad first. He answered on the second ring. His voice sounded guarded before I said anything. I told him Ruiz had spoken to the catering supervisor. There was a silence so complete I could hear the low television in the background at his house. Dad, I'm going to ask you one question. I need you to answer that question, not the question you wish I asked. He told me he had been advised not to discuss the investigation. This isn't about the investigation, it's about me. He said nothing. I asked whether Jason had told him before Teddy's party that he had hit a person. Dad did not deny it. Instead, he said Jason had been distraught and incoherent, that he had said several things, that nobody knew exactly what had happened. The answer was classic, Dad. Take one hard fact and surround it with logistics until its edges disappeared. Did he say he hit somebody? Dad said Jason had said something along those lines. The room seemed to narrow around me. I asked why he and Mom had spent the entire week telling me Jason had not said anything meaningful before police arrived. Dad rejected the word meaningful. He said Jason did not know where the person had gone, whether the person was seriously hurt, or even whether the impact had happened the way he remembered it. Jason had been panicked. It had been dark. Dad said they had not wanted to make a catastrophic assumption based on a frightened man's fragmented account. I listened until he finished. Then I asked what they did after hearing it. Dad said they told Jason to calm down. They wanted him to explain himself. They wanted to understand what happened. He said there was no reason to call police based on half a story, when the police would investigate any real collision anyway. There it was. Not denial. Management. Wait. Clarify. Reduce the number of things happening at once. Let someone else decide when the situation becomes official. I asked whether he looked at the SUV after Jason said he had hit somebody. Dad told me he had seen the damage. I closed my eyes. A week earlier, he had told me police were making assumptions from a car. Now I knew he had seen that car before the party even began. After hearing Jason say he had hit a person, I wanted to shout. Instead, my voice became very calm. At 6:17, I told you Cassidy was in the ICU because a driver hit her and left. Did you think of Jason? Dad paused. It was not a long pause. Maybe 2 seconds. It was enough. He said they did not know. That isn't what I asked. He said there were thousands of cars on the road and more than one collision in the world. He said I was connecting things after the fact, because now we knew Jason was the driver. I reminded him that it was their SUV. That ended the practical argument. He shifted to another one. He said even if the possibility occurred to them, possibility was not proof. They had no right to accuse their own son of nearly killing his niece without knowing the facts. He said police were already working the crash. He said anything real would come out soon enough. Cassidy might not have had soon enough. The words left my mouth before I could soften them. Dad breathed out slowly. I told him the doctor had asked me to call close family because the next hours were critical. I had asked them to come because I thought Cassidy might die before they saw her again. They had already heard Jason say he hit somebody. They had already seen damage on the SUV. They knew he had been driving illegally. And when I told them Cassidy had been the victim of a hit and run, they chose to stay at a birthday party and wait for certainty. Dad said they could not have done anything medically for Cassidy. The sentence was so familiar I almost laughed. No. You could have been her grandparents. He went quiet. I did not ask him to apologize. Not then. Apologies would have turned the conversation toward whether I was ready to forgive. I was still trying to understand what had actually happened. I asked whether Mom knew the same things he knew. Dad said yes. That answer hurt in a clean, direct way. No more wondering whether one parent had hidden part of it from the other. They had both heard enough. They had both chosen the same delay. I ended the call before he could turn it back into legal caution. Mom called less than 10 minutes later. I almost did not answer. Then I remembered all the times she had insisted that family problems should be discussed inside the family before outsiders distorted them. For once, I wanted to hear exactly what she would call this problem now that the facts would not fit inside the old version. She began by saying Dad was upset and that I had cornered him. She said I was taking an imprecise statement from a catering worker and treating it like a confession recorded under oath. I told her I was not doing that. I repeated only what I knew. Tanya saw Jason beside the damaged SUV, heard him say he hit somebody, and heard Mom say they would figure it out. Dad had now admitted he heard the same thing. Mom did not deny it. Instead, she said Jason was terrified. He had come home in the middle of the night after sitting somewhere for hours, barely able to explain himself. She said he believed someone had stepped into the road suddenly. He did not know who it was. He did not know how badly they were hurt. He had convinced himself maybe they had gotten up, maybe somebody else had stopped, maybe the damage looked worse than the impact had been. Every sentence placed Jason at the center. His fear, his confusion, his uncertainty. I let her finish. Then I asked the question I had been holding since Ruiz called. When I told you Cassidy was hit, did you think it might have been Jason? Silence. Not a dropped connection. Not hesitation because she had not heard me. I could hear her breathing. Mom? She said they did not know. I asked again, more quietly. Did you think it might have been him? She told me I was asking for a yes or no answer to something that had not felt yes or no in the moment. There had been guests. Jason was panicking. Dad was trying to understand the car damage. She had my message saying Cassidy was in the ICU, and the whole situation felt impossible. She said her mind had been going in 10 directions. That was the closest she came to yes. I sat on the edge of the hospital chair and looked at Cassidy sleeping. A soft plastic cup with a straw sat untouched on the bedside table. Her therapy schedule for the next morning had been written on a whiteboard in blue marker. Everything around her was organized around reducing risk and building recovery one small step at a time. My mother kept talking. She said if they had jumped to the conclusion that Jason hit Cassidy and been wrong, they could have destroyed his life. She said, accusing your own child of something that serious was not a step you took because 2 stories happened to sound similar. They needed time. They needed facts. They needed to be sure. I asked what they thought they were protecting by staying at the party. She said they were not protecting the party. The party was already happening. Guests were already there. The caterer had already been paid. Leaving would not have changed what happened Friday night. Jason was in no state to go anywhere. Cassidy was surrounded by doctors. The answer was painfully sincere. That was what finally broke something in me. If Mom had laughed about the balloons, or said Teddy mattered more, I could have hated her cleanly. Instead, she believed she was describing rational triage. Cassidy had professionals. Jason had them. Therefore, Jason needed them more. The old equation had survived even this. I told her the question was never whether they could perform brain surgery. It was whether they understood that their granddaughter might die while they sat in a house with the man who may have put her there. Mom's voice hardened. She said I was making it sound as if they had known for certain. They had not. I know you weren't certain. That stopped her. I said certainty was no longer the point. The point was that, when there was uncertainty about danger to Cassidy, they had treated it as a reason to do nothing. When there was uncertainty about consequences for Jason, they had treated it as a reason to protect him until more information arrived. Mom said that was unfair. Maybe it was. Families are not courtrooms. We do not get clean standards of proof before every moral choice. But that was exactly why the comparison mattered. I was not asking whether they could have convicted Jason at 6, 17. I was asking what they had done with the possibility that their son had struck someone and their granddaughter had just been struck by a fleeing driver. They had not called me back to ask where the crash happened. They had not asked what time. They had not told me Jason had come home with a damaged SUV. I did not know what they had told police about Jason's words. They had kept the party moving, and they had told me to stop being dramatic. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Mom said something that I think she meant as an explanation, maybe even as a plea. We were trying not to lose both our children. I looked at Cassidy's sleeping face and understood what my mother had just done. She had put Jason and my daughter on the same side of the scale. As if the consequences Jason feared and the life Cassidy had nearly lost were two versions of the same tragedy. For the rest of that night, I kept hearing Mom's sentence in the space between everything else. We were trying not to lose both our children. Cassidy slept while I sat beside her, and I understood that the story inside my parents' house had already started changing again. First, Jason had not done anything. Then nobody knew who had driven. Then he had driven but only panicked. Then they had known his license was suspended, but had been trying to help him keep a job. Then they had heard him say he hit somebody, but had not wanted to make an unfair accusation. Every time one version became impossible, another appeared that asked for just a little less responsibility. I did not call them again that night. I had learned something important about confrontation by then. If I kept asking the same people for a different moral answer, I could spend all my strength listening to them rearrange the furniture around the same truth. The next morning, Cassidy had her first longer physical therapy session. Longer meant 25 minutes. Before the crash, she could walk home from school, carrying a backpack, stop for fries, complain about a blister, and forget by dinner that her body had done any work at all. Now, 2 therapists helped her sit at the edge of the bed while protecting the fractures in her pelvis and leg. She had to concentrate on keeping her head upright. Sweat formed at her hairline after less effort than it used to take her to climb our stairs. I stood near the window and watched without cheering every movement. The therapist had warned me that too much celebration could make ordinary rehabilitation feel like a performance. Cassidy already hated being watched. She hated the belt around her waist. She hated being asked to rate dizziness on a scale. She hated that her left hand sometimes took an extra second to do what she meant. Mostly, she hated needing permission to stop. When the therapist finally told her they were done, Cassidy lowered herself back against the pillows and whispered, "That was stupid. It looked hard. It was sitting. Still looked hard." She closed her eyes, too tired to argue. That small exchange stayed with me because, on my phone, the family had begun describing Jason's life in the same vocabulary of exhaustion. Mom sent a message around lunchtime, saying Jason had barely slept since the crash. She said he was having panic attacks. She said his temp assignment was gone, and he was terrified about charges, money, and what came next. The message was not an apology, and not exactly a defense. It was an invitation to imagine him suffering. I did imagine it. That is the part people sometimes misunderstand when families split around something terrible. I did not wake up one morning unable to care that my brother was scared. Jason had been part of my life for 37 years. I could picture him pacing my parents' basement at 3 a.m. I could picture his hands shaking. I could remember him at 20, 25, 30, always believing the next mistake could somehow be fixed if he explained it correctly. His suffering was real. So was the fact that Cassidy had needed emergency brain surgery because he drove when he was not supposed to drive, struck her, and left. Those facts did not cancel each other. Mom kept trying to make them compete. A few hours later, she called. She told me Jason had finally been able to talk more clearly with his attorney about the collision. His version was no longer that he had only hit something. He now remembered enough to say the street had been dark, that someone had moved into the roadway quickly, and that he had panicked after the impact. He still said he had not known the person was Cassidy. I asked whether Mom was telling me this, because Jason's attorney wanted me to know. She said no. She was only trying to help me understand that the situation was more complicated than I was making it. I looked through the glass panel in Cassidy's room toward the hallway, where a nurse was pushing an empty wheelchair. What part am I making simple? Mom said I was talking as if Jason had seen Cassidy, aimed at her, and driven away on purpose. I have never said that. She went quiet. I told her I believed the collision itself could have been an accident. I had said that before. I knew darkness mattered to visibility. I knew panic was possible. I knew he may not have known who he struck. But he knew he wasn't allowed to drive, I said. And after the impact, he left. Mom answered with the same 2 words she had been using all week. He panicked. It was becoming a solvent. Panic explained leaving. Fear explained silence. Confusion explained the hours away from home. Love explained my parents' choices. If every decision could be dissolved into an emotion, nobody ever had to stand beside the decision itself. I ended the call without raising my voice. That afternoon, the wording shifted again. It came through a message from a relative I barely spoke to outside holidays. She said she had heard there were questions about whether Cassidy had been distracted when she crossed the street. She did not accuse Cassidy directly. She phrased it as concern. The way people do when they want the cruelty of a question without owning the question. Had Cassidy been wearing earbuds? Had she been looking at her phone? Did she step out suddenly? I stared at the message until the letters stopped feeling like language. I did not know who had started it. I did not know whether it came from Jason, his lawyer, my parents, or the ordinary family machine that turns uncertainty into whatever version hurts least. I also did not know every fact of the collision. The investigators had not told me Cassidy was using her phone. No evidence I had seen established earbuds. She had been struck in a marked crosswalk. Those were the facts I knew. I wrote back one sentence. I'm not going to speculate about Cassidy's behavior. Then I put the phone away. The message bothered me more than open hostility would have. If someone had called Cassidy reckless, I could have rejected it outright. This was softer. It asked for a little room. Maybe she was distracted. Maybe she moved quickly. Maybe Jason's reaction time had been limited. Maybe responsibility was not 100% where everyone thought it was. 10% was all they needed. If they could move 10% of the weight off Jason, it had to land somewhere. My daughter's body was the nearest place. I thought about the marked crosswalk, about Cassidy waking in the hospital, and asking whether she had done something wrong before she even understood what had happened to her. I remembered how quickly I had answered no. I understood then why that answer had mattered so much. A person does not have to be perfect to deserve protection after being hurt. Cassidy did not need to prove she had never glanced at a phone in her life. She did not need to become an ideal victim so adults could feel comfortable believing Jason was responsible for his choices. The investigation could determine facts. My family was doing something different. It was shopping for relief. 2 days later, Cassidy was transferred out of the acute unit and into inpatient rehabilitation. The move was medically good and emotionally strange. I had spent so many days measuring safety by the presence of ICU equipment that leaving it felt almost reckless. The rehab floor had brighter walls, more daylight, and a whiteboard with a schedule that looked absurdly busy for a girl who still needed a nap after washing her face. Occupational therapy, physical therapy, speech therapy, rest. Everything was work now. Cassidy complained about the schedule, which I took as evidence of personality rather than prognosis. She was still easily overwhelmed. She lost track of conversations when too many people talked at once. Her balance was unreliable. Pain could take a tolerable morning and flatten the afternoon. Some days she remembered every instruction. Other days I watched frustration rise in her face when a word stayed just beyond reach. She had also begun asking more questions, not all at once, never in the order I expected. She asked whether school knew. She asked whether her favorite jeans had been cut off in the emergency room. She asked if I had fed the neighbor's cat the weekend she was supposed to. Then, one afternoon while I was helping arrange pillows behind her, she looked at me and said, "Grandma and Grandpa didn't come, right?" I stopped moving. Cassidy watched my face. I had told her they had not been at the hospital during the worst days. I had not told her why. There had been no reason to make the dog party part of her recovery before she asked. "They weren't here," I said. She frowned slightly, working through something. "Because of Teddy?" I sat down. Memory after brain injury was strange. Some things she had heard once and forgotten. Other things seemed to return from conversations before the crash with sharp, random clarity. She remembered Teddy's birthday weekend because she had joked about it for weeks. I told her the main party had been happening when I called them. Cassidy stared at the blanket over her legs. They were really having Teddy's party? Her voice was not angry. That made it worse. Yes. She was quiet for a long time. I did not tell her that Jason had been in their house. I did not tell her Tanya had heard him say he hit somebody. I did not tell her Mom had called Jason and Cassidy, both our children, as if one was fighting for his future and the other had not been fighting for her life. Those facts would exist when Cassidy was ready for them. They did not need to be placed in her hands, because I wanted someone else to agree with me. Finally, she asked, "Did they know I was bad?" I knew what she meant. Yes. I told them the doctors were worried. Her mouth tightened. I reached for her hand, then stopped before touching it. Cassidy had begun to dislike people, deciding what kind of comfort she wanted. I let my hand rest on the bed between us instead. "You don't have to make sense of their decision right now," I said, "and you don't have to make anybody feel better about it." She looked at me. "What if they feel bad?" "Then they feel bad." That was as close as I came to giving her a lesson. I did not tell her to forgive them. I did not tell her to hate them. I did not say blood was blood. I did not tell her she would regret anger later. For once, I refused to turn a young person's pain into a job for the young person. Cassidy leaned her head back and closed her eyes. A minute later, she asked if she could skip speech therapy. I told her absolutely not. She called me evil. It was the best thing anyone had called me all week. The family pressure did not stop because Cassidy had moved to rehab. If anything, it became more organized. Dad started talking about practical consequences. The insurance company had questions about who regularly used the SUV. There were questions about Jason's license status, permission to drive, and what Mom and Dad had known when they let him use the vehicle. Dad did not give me legal conclusions, and I did not pretend to have them. He only told me enough to make clear that the issue was no longer limited to Jason's criminal case. The ownership of the SUV mattered. Permission mattered. Knowledge might matter. Their insurer wanted statements and records. A civil claim related to Cassidy's injuries was possible. Lawyers were talking about exposure and responsibility in language Dad hated because it could not be fixed with a phone call and a favor. He called it a mess. I almost told him the mess was lying in a rehab bed learning how to stand. I did not. The law could sort out what legal responsibility belonged to whom. I was not interested in inventing charges against my parents or pretending their silence automatically made them criminals. They had not hidden the SUV after police came. I had no evidence they destroyed anything. I did not know what Minnesota law would ultimately make of their decision to let Jason drive while suspended. But I knew what changed the moment Dad understood there might be consequences for him too. His questions changed. He stopped asking only what Jason had told police. He started asking what I had told them. At first, it was subtle. Had Ruiz asked me about old family issues? Had I mentioned how often Jason used the SUV? Did I remember exactly when Dad told me Jason could not drive? Was I sure Mom's old request for a ride had been because of the suspension and not because Jason's car had been unavailable? Each question could have been ordinary. Together they felt like someone walking around the edges of a room, checking where the walls were. I answered carefully. I did not volunteer more than the conversation required because, at that point, Detective Ruiz had not asked me for every old text or every memory. I also did not change anything to make Dad comfortable. If I knew, I said I knew. If I was not sure, I said I was not sure. That precision seemed to bother him more than anger would have. Mom handled the pressure differently. She wanted me to remember Jason as a person. She sent a photo from years earlier of him holding Cassidy on his shoulders at a county fair. I did not know whether she meant it as comfort or argument. Jason was grinning in the picture. Cassidy was 7 or 8, missing a front tooth and holding cotton candy above his head. I remembered that day. I also remembered Jason borrowing $20 from me for parking because he had forgotten his wallet. The picture did not make me angry. It made me sad. That was harder. I could love the man in an old photograph and still refuse to let the photograph rewrite the man who left a teenager in a crosswalk. Mom called later and asked whether I had shown the picture to Cassidy. No. Why not? Because rehab isn't the place to campaign for Jason. She said campaign was an ugly word. I told her I had not sent Cassidy pictures of Jason's damaged SUV either. Mom went quiet. I regretted the sharpness as soon as I said it, but I did not take it back. She told me Jason was already paying every minute. He had lost his job. He could not sleep. He was terrified of what the court would do. People who knew about the investigation were treating him differently. He was ashamed to leave the house. I listened to the list. Then I looked through the rehab room doorway and watched Cassidy practice transferring from a wheelchair to a padded bench with 2 therapists near her. There it was again. What would happen to Jason? That question had organized my family for years. When he missed shifts, the problem was losing the job. When his license was suspended, the problem became how he would get to work. Now, even after he drove, hit someone, and left, the people protecting him kept searching for a version that made the consequence smaller darkness, panic, Cassidy's possible distraction, my parents' good intentions. Each version shifted weight away from him and toward someone else. This time there was nowhere harmless left for it to land. One afternoon, a therapist brought Cassidy to a wide practice area where the floor changed texture near a mock curb. They were not asking her to cross a street. They were working on balance and confidence when surfaces changed under her feet. Cassidy had both hands on parallel bars and one therapist beside her. The moment she reached the dark strip meant to represent the edge, she froze. Nothing dramatic happened. She did not scream. She did not remember the crash in a sudden cinematic flash. She simply stopped. Her shoulders rose. Her grip tightened. Her breathing changed. The therapist waited. I waited too. After almost a minute, Cassidy whispered that she was tired. The therapist said that was okay and helped her back. On the way to her room, Cassidy was quiet. I did not turn the moment into a symbol for her. I carried it for myself. Later, while she slept, Dad called. His tone was different from the one he used when asking for updates. Controlled, businesslike. He said their insurance situation was becoming complicated. The lawyers were asking questions about vehicle access, Jason's suspended license, and who knew what. He said there could be civil issues beyond the criminal case. He did not say he and Mom were being charged with anything. He did not claim the police were targeting them. He was careful. Then he asked whether Detective Ruiz had spoken to me recently. I said not. Since the update about Tanya, and a brief follow-up, Dad paused. What did she ask? I told him she had asked factual questions about what I knew regarding Jason's access to the SUV. Another pause. The old version of my father would have asked how Cassidy's therapy went. This version asked whether I had discussed the suspension. I looked through the half-open door toward the therapy board, where someone had written Cassidy's goals for the week. I could feel the next stage of the family story arriving before Dad said it. Not denial anymore. Not even only protection for Jason. Self-protection. His voice stayed calm. What exactly have you told Detective Ruiz about Jason's license? Dad's question hung between us. What exactly have you told Detective Ruiz about Jason's license? I could hear the carefulness in it. He was not asking me to lie. He was not telling me to destroy a message or forget a conversation. If he had asked for something that obvious, I think I would have known how to react immediately. Instead, he was asking for the boundaries of what had already left the family. I told him Ruiz knew Jason's license was suspended, and that Mom and Dad had admitted allowing him to use the SUV for work and other trips they considered necessary. I said I had answered the questions she asked me. Dad wanted to know whether I had shown her old texts. I said, no, not yet. The relief in his silence was small, but I heard it. Then he gave me the argument I had been raised on, dressed in adult language. The investigators already had the vehicle. They had cameras. They had Jason's statements. They had Tanya's account. Lawyers were involved now. There was no reason, Dad said, for me to start handing over every private family conversation we had ever had, just because it might look connected in hindsight. You don't need to volunteer family business, he said. There it was. Not an order to lie or cover for Jason, just a request not to volunteer what the family already knew. It was such a modest request that, for one dangerous second, it sounded reasonable. I had spent most of my life believing that good families did not carry every ugly thing outside the house. We handled our own problems. We did not embarrass each other. We did not give strangers more information than they needed. When Jason borrowed money and did not repay it, that stayed inside the family. When Dad canceled plans to rescue him, I complained to no one who mattered. When Mom asked me to drive Jason because he could not drive himself, I treated it as inconvenience, not evidence of anything larger. Privacy had always sounded like dignity. Now I understood how easily it could become insulation. I told Dad I was not interested in giving police a family autobiography. I would not speculate about things I did not know. I would not turn every old disappointment into part of the crash. But if Ruiz asked me what I knew about Jason's suspension and their decision to let him drive anyway, I would answer. Dad said answering was different from volunteering. The distinction mattered to him so much that I knew the conversation was no longer about my judgment. It was about reducing the number of facts that could be attached to theirs. He reminded me that memories changed under stress. He said old texts could be taken out of context. He pointed out that telling me Jason couldn't drive months earlier did not prove what either parent understood about every detail of the suspension. He was not entirely wrong. Context mattered. Memory was imperfect. That was exactly why I had been forcing myself to separate what I remembered from what I could actually show. I told him that. He became quiet again. That night, after Cassidy fell asleep, I scrolled through my phone. I did not search for ammunition. I searched for the places where memory and record met. There was Mom's message from late summer asking whether I could take Jason to an appointment because he still could not drive himself. There was Dad's message warning me not to lend Jason my car. There were ordinary exchanges about early shifts, rides, and how long they expected the suspension problem to last. None of them proved the crash. None of them proved what Mom and Dad thought at 6, 17. Tanya's account dealt with that part of the timeline. What the messages proved was narrower. My parents knew the driving problem existed. They treated it as serious enough to warn me not to lend him my car. Then they created exceptions with their own. I took screenshots only because I had learned not to trust my ability to find anything quickly when I was tired. They stayed in my phone. I did not send them anywhere that night. I sat in the dim rehab room listening to Cassidy breathe and tried to understand why not sending them felt like a decision. If I stayed quiet, the case would not disappear. Jason had already admitted driving. Police had the SUV. Cameras had placed it on the route. Tanya had given them a timeline. My silence would not magically save him. That was what made the choice harder. I was not standing at a gate marked justice on one side and family on the other. There was no heroic act required from me to make the case exist. I could do nothing, and the machinery would probably keep moving. That was exactly how the old family system had survived. No one person had to do something dramatic. We only had to choose the smallest, comfortable silence available to us. The next morning, Cassidy returned to the practice area with the mock curb. The day before, she had frozen at the dark strip on the floor and asked to stop. No one had treated that as failure. Her therapist had simply written it down as information and moved on. This time, Cassidy stared at the strip before she even reached it. Her right hand tightened around the parallel bar. Her left leg was still limited by the fracture and weakness, and the therapist stood close enough to support her without touching unless Cassidy needed it. The room smelled faintly of rubber flooring and disinfectant. Somewhere behind us, another patient was practicing with a walker, while a television played too quietly to understand. Cassidy took one slow step, then another. When she came within a foot of the dark strip, her breathing changed. The therapist asked whether she wanted to stop or stand there for a moment. Cassidy looked annoyed. "Stand," she said. So they stood. No speech, no breakthrough, no memory suddenly returning. Just my daughter upright between two metal rails, staring at a line on the floor that her body understood differently than her mind did. I watched from several feet away, because the therapists had taught me that love did not always mean moving closer. After maybe 30 seconds, Cassidy shifted her weight forward. Her face tightened. Then she moved one foot onto the dark strip. She immediately moved it back. The therapist nodded, as if Cassidy had done exactly what she had come to do. Cassidy looked at me. "Don't clap." "I wasn't going to. You had the face." "I have no idea what that means." She almost smiled. The exchange lasted less than 10 seconds, but it stayed with me through the rest of the day. My parents wanted me to think about whether an old text could hurt Jason or expose them to more questions. Cassidy was learning how to place her foot on a painted strip because a crosswalk no longer felt ordinary to her nervous system. The consequences were not theoretical on one side and emotional on the other. They were in her body. That afternoon, Mom called. Dad had clearly told her about our conversation because she began in the middle of an argument we had not yet had. She said nobody was asking me to lie. She repeated that twice. I told her I knew. She said their attorney had advised them not to discuss more than necessary, and Jason's attorney had his own job to do. Police already knew Jason had been driving. There was no reason for me to pile on by handing over old family messages that had nothing to do with the night of the crash. I asked whether Dad's warning not to lend Jason my car had nothing to do with what they knew about his driving status. Mom said that was not what she meant. Then she softened. Her voice changed from defensive to tired, which had always been more effective on me. She said they were scared. Jason was scared. Dad was worried about insurance and lawyers. She was worried their family was going to be permanently destroyed over one terrible night. She said I had every right to be angry, but anger could make people do things they could not take back. I looked through the window at Cassidy's empty wheelchair parked beside the therapy room. She was inside with the therapist, out of sight. For most of my life, that sentence would have worked. Do not do something you cannot take back. It had been one of my mother's favorite warnings, whenever emotion entered a room. Sleep on it. Do not send the message tonight. Do not say the cruel thing. Do not make a permanent decision when you are hurt. Sometimes that was good advice, but it had also taught me to believe that speaking clearly was more dangerous than letting the original harm sit untouched. I told Mom I was not making a decision out of anger. I was making one because I finally understood what silence did in our family. She asked what that meant. I said I had spent years assuming that if I was not the person causing the problem, staying out of it made me neutral. But every time Jason needed consequences softened, the rest of us helped by withholding something. A complaint, a boundary, a repayment, a hard no. This time the thing being requested was information. Mom said that was unfair. She said family privacy was not the same as covering up a crime. I agreed. Again, agreement seemed to disturb her more than accusation. I'm not calling it a cover-up, I said. I'm saying I'm not going to edit what I know because it makes things easier for us. She did not answer for several seconds. When she spoke again, she said the lawyers could decide what was relevant. I said investigators could decide that too. The conversation ended quietly. No one called anyone evil. No one threatened to disown anyone. That would have been easier to recognize as a breaking point. Instead, I hung up and knew something had changed because I no longer felt responsible for repairing the silence afterward. The next day, I called Detective Ruiz. I told her I wanted to clarify the information I had already given about Jason's driving status and his access to my parents' SUV. She did not sound surprised. She arranged a time to speak with me when Cassidy was in therapy, so I would not be dividing my attention. The interview was not dramatic. That mattered. Ruiz did not sit across from me and ask me to explain my family. She asked specific questions. I answered them as specifically as I could. I told her what I remembered Dad saying months earlier about Jason not being able to drive until he got the problem straightened out. Then I showed her the later text where he warned me not to lend Jason my car. I told her Mom had asked me to drive Jason to an appointment because he still could not drive himself. I showed her that message too. I described what both parents had told me after the crash, that they sometimes allowed Jason to use the SUV for work or other trips they considered essential because transportation was difficult and they were trying to help him keep his job. Ruiz asked when those admissions had happened. I gave her approximate dates and told her which parts came from phone calls rather than written messages. When I remembered something but could not place the exact date, I said so. When I knew a statement existed in writing, I showed her. When I believed something based on the pattern but could not prove it, I labeled it as my interpretation and waited for her to decide whether it mattered. At one point she stopped me after I said my parents had made sure Jason had access to the SUV. What do you mean by made sure? She asked. The question irritated me for half a second because the phrase felt true. Then I understood why she was asking. I corrected myself. I said my parents had admitted they permitted him to use their SUV on some occasions, despite knowing his license was suspended. I did not know exactly who handed him the keys Friday night. I did not see that happen. I did not know whether he took them from the tray with permission that night, or relied on standing permission from prior exceptions. Ruiz wrote something down. That moment was more important to me than I expected. I had spent weeks listening to my family stretch words until responsibility became smaller. I did not want to answer by stretching words in the opposite direction. Truth did not need my help becoming dramatic. Near the end, I asked whether the messages changed the case. Ruiz was careful. She said they did not automatically prove criminal responsibility for my parents, and they did not convict Jason of anything by themselves. The messages could help corroborate that the suspension was known inside the family, and that vehicle access was not a one-time surprise invented after the crash. Tanya's statement, the vehicle evidence, the camera timeline, Jason's account, and other information each had their own function. No single piece did everything. I was strangely relieved. I did not want to be the person holding the one document that decided everyone's fate. I wanted to stop carrying facts that were not mine to hide. Before I left, Ruiz asked whether I understood that the material could become part of the broader investigative and legal process. I said yes. My stomach hurt when I said it. Doing the right thing did not feel clean. It felt like signing away the version of my family where, eventually, everyone calmed down and came back to the same table. On the elevator back upstairs, I kept expecting guilt to arrive as proof that I had done something wrong. It came, but it did not feel like proof. It felt like muscle memory. My family had trained me to experience other people's discomfort as a task. If Dad was worried, I looked for a way to reassure him. If Mom cried, I softened whatever I had said. If Jason was cornered by consequences, somebody found a door, standing alone in that elevator. I realized guilt could survive even after the obligation behind it was gone. The feeling was real. The instruction inside it was not automatically valid. I returned to the rehab floor and found Cassidy asleep after therapy, one hand curled near her chin. Her hair had started growing awkwardly around the shaved area near the surgical site. There were bruises, fading through colors I would never have believed skin could hold. Her wheelchair was angled beside the bed. A pair of non-slip socks lay on the floor where she had kicked them off. I sat beside her and felt grief for things that had not technically happened yet. Thanksgivings that might be different. Phone calls that might stop. My mother's name appearing on the screen and making my shoulders tense. My father no longer calling me practical with the warm pride that had once made the word feel like love. Loss did not wait for legal outcomes. Sometimes it arrived the moment you stopped cooperating with an old arrangement. 2 days later, Mom called while Cassidy was in physical therapy. Her voice was so quiet, I almost did not recognize the emotion beneath it. "You gave them family messages?" I stood in the hallway outside the therapy gym. Through the glass, I could see Cassidy between the parallel bars. Her therapist was adjusting something near her foot. I said yes. Mom asked why I would do that when police already knew Jason's license was suspended. Because they were not only messages about Jason's license, they were evidence of what the family knew and how we had treated the suspension before the crash. But I did not give her that answer like a prosecutor. "I gave them the truth," I said. Mom breathed in sharply. She said the truth did not require volunteering every private conversation a family had ever had. She said I had no idea what lawyers could make out of casual texts. She said Dad had warned me about lending Jason my car because he worried about insurance, not because he thought Jason was some kind of danger. She said they had been trying to keep their son employed, not put Cassidy in harm's way. I did not argue with any of those intentions. I told her I had said the same thing to Ruiz. The messages did not show that they wanted anybody hurt. I had not claimed they did. That did not calm her. Intent was the safest ground my parents had left, and they kept trying to widen it until it covered every consequence. Mom asked whether I understood what could happen to Jason if prosecutors believed the worst version of everything. I said I understood that decisions about charges and outcomes were not mine. She said that was convenient. The word stung because it was one I had silently used for years to describe the role my family assigned me. Convenient daughter. Reliable daughter. The one who could take care of herself. The one who did not need the ride, the money, the extra call, the second chance. The one who could absorb a little more because she always had. I looked through the glass. Cassidy had reached the practice curb again. This time I was too far away to hear what the therapist said. I saw Cassidy grip the bar, look down, breathe, and shift her weight. Mom's voice came through the phone. "Then whatever happens to your brother is on you." For years, that sentence would have found a place inside me to live. It would have made me search backward for the moment I could still fix everything. I would have wondered whether one less text, one softer answer, one private fact kept private, could protect the family from breaking. Through the glass, Cassidy lowered one foot onto the dark strip. Her therapist did not pull her forward. I did not move toward the door. Cassidy put her weight down because she was ready. And for the first time in my life, I knew my mother's sentence was not true. The quiet after Mom's accusation lasted longer than any argument we had ever had. For the next several days, my parents did not call. Dad sent one short text asking whether Cassidy was still in inpatient rehab. I answered yes. He wrote, "Glad she's improving." That was the entire exchange. Mom did not message at all. The family group chat, which had once carried pictures of dog cakes and holiday plans and bad jokes about weather, became a place I opened only when a notification refused to disappear. Most people said nothing directly to me. A few did. An aunt I saw maybe twice a year wrote that she was praying for everyone and hoped I would remember that lawyers exist for a reason. A cousin said this whole thing was already terrible enough without family members making statements against each other. Neither one accused me of lying. Neither one said Cassidy mattered less. The message underneath was softer and harder to argue with. I could have let the professionals handle it. I did not need to make myself part of Jason's downfall. I read those messages and felt the old reflex wake up. Explain myself. Make them understand. Clarify that I had not marched into a police station with a box of family secrets. Tell them I had answered questions, shown ordinary messages, corrected myself when I overstated something, and refused to speculate when I did not know. Then I stopped. If I had learned anything, it was that explanations could become another form of work. I did so other people would not have to sit with discomfort. I had told the truth. I did not need to turn that truth into something emotionally painless for every relative who preferred the family as it had been. Cassidy had no interest in any of it. Her world had narrowed to therapy schedules, pain levels, sleep, food, and the humiliations of needing help with things she had once done without thinking. Some mornings she woke determined, and sharp enough to argue about what she wanted to wear. By afternoon she could be too tired to finish a sentence. Her brain injury made progress uneven. Her fractures made even good days physically expensive. The morning after Mom told me whatever happened to Jason was on me, Cassidy spent 10 minutes trying to put on a sweatshirt without help. She got one arm through, lost track of the second sleeve, became furious at the fabric, and finally threw the sweatshirt onto the bed. I hate this thing. You picked it. I picked it before it betrayed me. I laughed before I could stop myself. Cassidy looked at me, offended for half a second, then laughed too. It was short and breathless, and made her wince, because her body still objected to sudden movement. But it was laughter, not bravery, not inspiration, just a 16-year-old declaring war on a sweatshirt. For the rest of that morning, the case felt farther away. It did not stay far. Detective Ruiz called later in the week with the kind of update I had learned to recognize. Not one new piece of evidence, but several old pieces becoming harder to separate. The examination of the SUV supported its involvement in the collision. Camera sequences continued to fit the route and timing. Jason's phone location timeline fit the hours when the SUV was away from my parents' house, and then the gap after the crash, when he had stayed away for several hours before returning. His suspended driving status was documented. Tanya's account anchored the damaged SUV and the family conversation before my 6:17 call. The messages I had provided supported that Mom and Dad knew Jason was not supposed to be driving, and had previously treated that fact as serious enough to warn me not to lend him my car. None of those things solved the whole story alone. Together, they left less room for the story to keep changing. That mattered more than I expected. For weeks, I had lived inside versions. Jason had hit something. Jason had hit someone. He had panicked. It was dark. Cassidy may have moved suddenly. Mom and Dad had known nothing. Then they had known something, but not enough. They had been helping him work. They had been protecting family privacy. Every new fact seemed to produce a new sentence designed to make the old facts smaller. Evidence did not argue. It simply stayed where it was. Ruiz did not tell me what charge would ultimately stick, or what kind of plea might be discussed. She said those decisions belonged to prosecutors, defense counsel, and eventually the court process. The investigation was moving forward. The case was no longer waiting for one dramatic answer. About a week later, a victim services coordinator connected with the prosecutor's office called and explained that Jason's attorney had asked whether a written message could be passed to me through proper channels. I was told I did not have to receive it. I could decline without explanation. If I accepted, I did not have to answer. My first instinct was no, not because I hated Jason. Hate would have been simpler. I did not want his words entering Cassidy's rehab room and becoming another thing I had to manage. I did not want an apology to create a new obligation. I did not want to wonder whether refusing to respond made me cruel. Then I realized those were all reasons about what I might be required to do after reading it. No one was requiring anything. I accepted the message. It arrived as a printed copy through the coordinator, rather than directly from Jason. I read it alone in a small family lounge, while Cassidy was in occupational therapy. Jason did not write beautifully. He never had. His message was uneven, repetitive in places, and painfully familiar in the way his mind moved toward explanation before responsibility. He said he had panicked. He said the road had been dark. He said he had not known the person he hit was Cassidy. He said he had replayed the moment until he could barely sleep. He said leaving was wrong. He said he wished he had stopped. He said he was sorry for what Cassidy was going through, and sorry for what I had gone through beside her. Then, near the end, he wrote the sentence I had expected before I opened the page. "I'm your brother." I sat with that line longer than the apology. It was not a threat. It was not even manipulation in the crude sense. Jason had spent his whole life believing relationship changed the size of consequences. Parents paid because they were parents. I gave rides because I was his sister. Debts softened because we were family. Rules bent because the person inside them was someone we loved. I believed he was sorry. That realization hurt more than deciding he was lying would have. I believed he had moments when he woke with the collision in his head. I believed he felt sick, knowing Cassidy was the person he had struck. I believed he regretted leaving. I even believed some part of him understood that the story he had told himself in those first hours, that maybe the person got up, maybe someone else helped, maybe it was not as bad as the damage looked, had been cowardice dressed as uncertainty. But his remorse still contained a question. Would being sorry change what had to happen next? I folded the message once and put it back in the envelope. I did not answer. Not yet. I returned to the therapy floor just in time to see Cassidy finish a session. She was using a walker that day, rather than the parallel bars. Her therapist stayed close. Cassidy moved slowly, concentrating so hard that her jaw tightened with each step. She reached the end of the short-marked path, stopped, and looked down. Someone had put a strip of bright tape on the floor to show where she should turn. Cassidy stared at it, then looked at the therapist. "Seriously? More tape?" The therapist smiled. "It's very advanced tape." Cassidy looked toward me. "Mom, I'm being rehabilitated by office supplies." I laughed so hard I had to cover my mouth. The therapist did too. Cassidy turned carefully, took 3 more steps, and lowered herself into the wheelchair. She was exhausted when she finished. Her face had gone pale, but she was smiling. That was the gain. Not that she walked a certain number of feet. Not that she defeated fear forever. The next day could still be worse. Her balance could still fail. Pain could still knock out an afternoon. The gain was that for 30 seconds, she got to be annoyed at tape instead of afraid of a crossing. I held on to that. The family outside the rehab unit kept changing shape. Mom and Dad had always functioned as a team when Jason needed help, but pressure began pulling their instincts apart. I heard it first in separate phone calls. Mom wanted repair through feeling. She told me Jason was remorseful. She wanted me to understand that he was not a monster. She wanted me to remember the version of him who had loved Cassidy before the crash. She said relatives were asking questions, and that the family did not need to turn this into public hatred. Her fear was moral and emotional, that Jason would become nothing but the worst thing he had done, and that our family would become nothing but the night Cassidy was hit. Dad's fear was different. He wanted the words narrowed. He asked what the insurance company had requested from me. He asked whether I had spoken with anyone about permission to use the SUV. He reminded me that allowing Jason to use the vehicle on previous occasions did not prove they had authorized that exact trip Friday night. He was careful not to tell me what to say. He simply kept returning to precision now that precision might protect him. The strange thing was that I agreed with him about precision. I did not know whether Mom or Dad handed Jason the keys that night. I did not know whether he relied on an old habit of access. I did not know whether they expected him to drive anywhere Friday evening. I would not claim those things. Dad seemed frustrated that accuracy did not automatically produce exoneration. Mom seemed frustrated that love did not automatically produce forgiveness. Their arguments with each other began leaking through. Mom told me Dad was treating everything like an insurance file. Dad told me Mom kept calling people and making emotional promises no lawyer would make. Neither gave me details I had not asked for. I did not need them. I could hear the split in the way they described the same goal. Mom wanted the family restored. Dad wanted the damage contained. Both still wanted Jason protected. They simply no longer agreed on how. One evening, Dad called while I was eating dinner from a paper container in Cassidy's room. He said discussions were beginning about how Jason's case might move forward. He did not give me terms, and I did not ask for them. He said there could eventually be a plea process rather than a trial, depending on decisions between the attorneys and prosecutors. For once, he did not tell me what he wanted. He only said, "Your mother is going to call you." The warning made my stomach tighten. She called 20 minutes later. I almost let it go to voicemail. Cassidy was asleep with one hand under her cheek, and the room was quiet. Then I stepped into the hallway and answered. Mom's voice sounded exhausted. She said Jason's attorney believed there would be a stage where the impact on Cassidy and on our family could matter. She said she was not asking me to lie. She said that immediately, before I had spoken. I leaned against the wall. She told me the collision had been an accident. She said even I had acknowledged that. Jason had not aimed at Cassidy. He had not known it was her. He had made a terrible decision by leaving, and he would live with that for the rest of his life. She said nothing that was completely false. That was why the call hurt. Then she told me what she wanted. If I was asked for my view, she wanted me to say our family did not want Jason destroyed. She wanted me to say we understood it had been a tragic accident. She wanted me to say Cassidy was recovering. She wanted me to say Jason deserved a chance to rebuild his life. I listened without interrupting. Mom's voice shook when she said, "He needs one more chance." The phrase dropped into me with the weight of something much older than the crash. One more chance. Jason had needed one more chance after the missed rent. One more chance after the job he lost. One more chance after the money he did not repay. One more chance after the driving violations. One more chance when his license was suspended and getting to work became more important than the reason the suspension existed. My parents had never called it a system. They had called each rescue temporary. One more. Only this time, I asked Mom what she meant by one more chance. She said she meant a chance to work again someday. A chance not to have the rest of his life defined by one night. A chance to make amends. I said nothing. She asked whether I had received Jason's message. I told her I had. "Then you know he's sorry." "I think he is." The answer surprised her. I could hear it in the silence. I did not need Jason to be remorseless in order to believe consequences belonged to him. Mom started crying quietly. Not dramatically. No sobbing. Just the sound of someone trying to keep her voice steady and failing. She said she did not know how we had gotten here. I almost answered that I did. But sorrow had replaced the anger I expected. I thought of Dad putting down one end of my bookcase years earlier, because Jason needed them more. I thought of Mom packing the sandwiches back into the cooler. I thought of all the times I had said okay, because family life felt easier when the capable person gave up first. I also thought of Jason's message. "I'm your brother." All of them were reaching for the same lever. Relationship. Not facts. Not innocence. Relationship. Mom said she knew Cassidy had suffered. She knew I had suffered. She said she would never forgive herself for not coming to the ICU when I called. It was the closest she had come to naming that failure without defending it. For a second, I wanted to take the opening. I wanted to tell her I missed her. I wanted to let one honest sentence become a bridge back to the old family. Then she kept talking. She said we could not undo that night, but we could decide whether another life was ruined by it. Another life. Jason's. Cassidy's life was already divided into before and after, but Mom still spoke as if the next irreversible harm was waiting to happen to him. I closed my eyes. I'm not asking for revenge, I said. I know. I'm not asking anyone to destroy him. I know that too. Then what are you asking me to do? She was quiet for several seconds. When she answered, her voice was almost a whisper. She wanted me to use whatever voice I had in the process to ask for leniency. To tell them we were still a family. To say we wanted healing, not punishment. To make sure the people deciding what happened to Jason understood that he had people who loved him, and that the worst thing he had ever done was not the only thing he had ever done. Every part of that sentence sounded human. Every part of it could be true, and still, underneath it, I could feel the old machinery turning. The consequence had finally reached Jason. My mother was asking me to help move it again. I looked through the narrow window in Cassidy's door. She was still asleep. Her walker stood folded near the wall. On the bedside table sat the plastic cup she kept complaining, made water taste like hospital. Her life had become a collection of ordinary inconveniences, built on top of catastrophic injury. I thought about the kind of person I had always been afraid of becoming. Hard, unforgiving. The daughter who walked away when family needed her. That fear still had power. Mom knew it because she had helped build it. Maybe not intentionally. Maybe she believed every word she was saying. I believed she loved Jason. I believed she loved me. I even believed she loved Cassidy. Love was not the question anymore. The question was what love was allowed to erase. Mom said my name. I did not answer. Then she said the words that stripped every softer version away. Just once. Choose your brother. I stood in the rehab hallway with the phone against my ear and understood that it was the first time my mother had said plainly what she had been asking me to do my entire life. My mother's words followed me back into Cassidy's room. Just once, choose your brother. I did not answer her that night. There was nothing useful left to say, while Cassidy slept 10 feet away, one leg supported on pillows and her walker folded against the wall. I ended the call, sat down beside the bed, and watched the slow rise of her chest until the part of me that had always rushed to repair my mother's pain stopped reaching for the phone. For most of my life, choosing Jason had never been described as choosing against anyone else. It had been a ride to work, alone, an interrupted dinner, an afternoon moved around, a rule made flexible because he was having a harder time. The cost had been spread thin enough that nobody had to name who paid it. Now Mom had finally said the quiet part plainly. There were 2 people on the scale, and she wanted my hand on Jason's side. The next morning, a victim services coordinator called while Cassidy was in speech therapy. The prosecutor's office was preparing for the next stage of the case, and because Cassidy was a minor and still recovering from a serious brain injury, I could provide a parent's impact statement. Cassidy could participate if she wanted, and if her medical team thought it was reasonable, but nobody expected her to perform grief for a courtroom. The coordinator explained the process in a few practical sentences and told me I could write about physical harm, emotional impact, financial disruption, and what the offense had changed in our lives. I could also state my view about sentencing. I did not have to recommend a particular number. That last part mattered. For days, my family had treated my voice as if it were a lever that could either save Jason or destroy him. The actual form in front of me was quieter than that. Blank space. A place to describe what happened after a driver who was not legally supposed to be driving struck my daughter and left her in a crosswalk. I began with the hospital because that was where my memory still broke into the clearest pieces. The emergency call, the neurosurgeon explaining pressure inside Cassidy's skull, the consent forms, the ventilator. The first night when nobody could promise me she would wake up, I wrote about the pelvic and leg fractures. Without turning them into medical exposition, I wrote that survival had led directly into rehabilitation, that sitting upright had once exhausted her, that she had needed help moving from a wheelchair to a bench, and that the edge of a simulated curb could make her nervous system react before her conscious mind understood why. Then I wrote about things no scan could show. Cassidy startling at mechanical sounds, losing words when she was tired, the way she had asked whether she had done something wrong, her fear around crossings. The fact that returning home, school, and ordinary teenage independence would happen on a schedule her body set, not one we could choose. I wrote about work too. My employer had been kind, but kindness did not erase missed time, leave paperwork, appointments, calls with insurers, or the hours spent coordinating care because there was no second parent to divide it with. Cassidy's father had been dead for 8 years. Every medical decision and every night beside her bed had landed with me. I almost left my parents out. Then I understood that would have been another form of editing. I did not write that they caused the collision. I did not write that they intended Cassidy harm. I wrote what was true. They knew Jason's license was suspended and had made exceptions that allowed him to use their SUV. After he returned with damage and said he had hit somebody, they had information that should have made my later hit-and-run message matter differently. When I begged them to come to the ICU because Cassidy might die, they stayed at Teddy's birthday party and told me to stop being dramatic. The investigation had not only damaged my trust in Jason, it had exposed what my family had been willing to minimize in order to protect him. When I finished the first draft, I read it twice. There was no sentence asking the judge to ruin my brother's life, no demand for the maximum punishment, and no claim that the collision itself had been intentional. There was only consequence. I saved the document and waited until Cassidy came back from therapy before deciding whether to mention it to her. She looked tired, so I waited through lunch and a nap. That evening, when she was awake enough to complain that the hospital's mashed potatoes had the personality of wallpaper paste, I told her there would eventually be a court hearing about Jason, and that I was writing about how the crash had affected us. She stared at the television without really watching it. I told her she did not have to write anything. She did not have to speak. If she wanted me to include something she felt, she could tell me now, later, or never. Cassidy was quiet long enough that I thought she might be finished with the conversation. Then she asked, "Do I have to see him?" No. That was all she wanted to know that night. 2 days later, she handed me a torn piece of notebook paper after occupational therapy. Her handwriting was shakier than it had been before the crash, and one word had been crossed out twice. She had written that she wanted to be able to cross the street without thinking about the car that did not stop. Nothing about prison. Nothing about revenge. Nothing about forgiveness. I asked if she wanted me to include it. She nodded once. So I did. Mom called 3 times during the week I finalized the statement. I answered once. She repeated what she had already said, but this time she sounded less like someone making an emotional plea and more like someone trying to construct the strongest argument she could honestly live with. Jason had not gone looking for Cassidy. He had not known she was in the crosswalk. He had not wanted any of this. She said a person could make one terrible decision in panic, without being a terrible person forever. There was truth in that. Dad's argument had truth too. He said no sentence would restore Cassidy's lost weeks or undo brain surgery. Sending Jason into the harshest possible consequence, he said, would not make her walk faster or sleep better. It would not erase the moment in the road. I did not dismiss either argument. That was what made the choice harder than anger. If Jason had intended to hurt Cassidy, there would have been less to untangle. If my parents had felt nothing, I could have closed a door and called the problem solved. Instead, I was dealing with people who loved badly, in ways they believed were loving. Jason was sorry. Mom was afraid. Dad could make reasonable points about proportionality. I could agree with all of that and still refuse the job they were assigning me. The collision could have been an accident. Driving while his license was suspended, leaving after the impact, and spending hours away from home telling himself the person might be fine were choices. My parents' years of making exceptions did not make them the driver, but those exceptions had kept access open where there should have been a boundary. Their minimization afterward was another choice, and turning the story toward Cassidy's possible distraction was another one. Not every bad outcome was planned. That did not make every decision accidental. By the time Cassidy was discharged from inpatient rehabilitation, winter had started pressing against Minnesota. The first dirty piles of snow gathered along parking lot edges. She came home with outpatient therapy appointments, a walker she still needed depending on the day, instructions about fatigue and overstimulation, and a list of follow-up visits long enough to cover half the refrigerator. Homecoming was not cinematic. Cassidy stood in our entryway and stared at the stairs as if our townhouse had personally insulted her. I had moved what I could to make the main floor easier. She noticed immediately that I had relocated one of her favorite chairs. "You made it weird." "I made it accessible." "You made it weird accessibly." I nearly cried from relief at the complaint. The case kept moving, while our life began rebuilding around smaller measurements. A shower without needing to lie down afterward. 15 minutes of schoolwork before a headache. A short walk with supervision. A night when Cassidy slept 5 hours without waking from a dream she could not remember. The prosecutor eventually told me Jason had agreed to resolve the most serious part of the case through a plea rather than force a trial. The legal language was more complicated than the family language had ever been, but the core was simple. The felony count reflected that he had caused great bodily harm and then left the scene. His suspended license driving remained part of the case and the record. His attorney could argue mitigation. The prosecutor could present the evidence and the harm. The court would decide the sentence under Minnesota law and the applicable guidelines. No one needed me to decide whether Jason was guilty. That decision was no longer sitting in my hands. What remained in my hands was whether I would ask the court to make his consequence smaller because he was my brother. A week before sentencing, I received another message through the same proper channel as before. Jason had written only a page this time. There were fewer explanations. He said he had read enough of the case materials to understand how long he had been away from the scene and how badly Cassidy had been hurt. He said he knew now that panic sounded like an excuse, because it had become one. He wrote that he should have stopped, should have called for help, and should never have been driving. Then he apologized to Cassidy by name. I had waited weeks to see him do that. It hurt when he finally did. Near the end, he asked me not to believe that the uncle Cassidy had known had been fake. He said he loved her. He said if she never wanted to see him again, he understood. Then he wrote that he hoped someday I could remember he had been my little brother before he became the person who did this. I put the page down and cried in my kitchen after Cassidy went to bed. Not because I had changed my mind, because he was right about one thing. He had been my little brother. I remembered teaching him how to ride a bike on a cracked sidewalk while Dad jogged behind us. I remembered Jason calling me from a gas station when he was 19, because he had locked his keys in his car and was too embarrassed to call our parents. I remembered him sitting on my kitchen floor with Cassidy after my husband died. I remembered 100 versions of him that had never imagined a dark road, a suspended license, a girl in a crosswalk. I wanted those memories to count. They did count. They just did not count as payment. At the sentencing hearing, I did not bring Cassidy. She did not want to go, and her care team saw no reason she needed to sit through it. That decision annoyed Mom when she learned about it, which confirmed for me that keeping Cassidy home was right. Cassidy was not a symbol our family could arrange in a courtroom to prove forgiveness, suffering, unity, or anything else. The courtroom itself was smaller than I had imagined. There was no television drama in it, no crowd waiting for a shocking reveal. No one gasped when I entered. I sat where victim services had directed me and kept my statement folded in my hands. Mom and Dad were there with Jason. Seeing them together still hurt. Dad wore a dark jacket I had seen at funerals and weddings. Mom sat close to Jason. I did not study their faces for clues. I had spent enough of this story trying to decode people when facts were available. Jason looked older than he had in the photographs Mom used to send me. When he turned and saw me, he did not come over. He gave a small nod. I returned it before I could decide whether I wanted to. That was the last private kindness I offered him that day. The hearing moved through legal steps I would barely remember later. The plea and presentence material were discussed. The prosecutor summarized the offense and the harm. Jason's attorney emphasized that the collision itself had not been intentional, that Jason had accepted responsibility, and that he had expressed remorse. My parents had submitted support for leniency. Then it was my turn. I had been given the option to have my written statement presented, but I decided to read the central part myself. My hands shook when I stood. I could feel Mom somewhere behind Jason. I did not look at her. I told the court about Cassidy. Not the ideal version of her. My actual daughter. 16, impatient, funny when she was tired. A girl who had walked home through a marked crosswalk and woken days later, unable to understand why sitting upright was hard. I described the surgery, ventilation, fractures, inpatient rehabilitation, ongoing therapy, fear around crossings, and the way brain injury had made ordinary tasks unpredictable. I included Cassidy's sentence about wanting to cross a street without thinking about the car that did not stop. Then I said what I had spent months learning how to say, without turning it into revenge. I believe the collision was accidental. I do not believe leaving her there was. The room stayed quiet. I said Jason was my brother, and that I believed some of his remorse was real. I said I did not want a sentence designed to destroy him. I also would not ask the court to reduce the consequence, simply because our family had spent years protecting him from consequences before. I did not tell the judge what theme to learn from my life. I did not ask for the maximum. I asked only that Cassidy's recovery not be used as proof that the harm had become small, and that Jason's love for us not be treated as a substitute for accountability. Then I sat down. For several seconds, my legs shook hard enough that I pressed both feet against the floor. The choice became real for me there, not in the sentence, not in whether Mom cried, and not in whether Jason looked at me. I had been asked to choose my brother, and for the first time I understood that refusing to carry his consequence away was not the same as abandoning him. Jason spoke later. His apology was imperfect because people are imperfect even when they mean what they say. He said he wished he could take back the moment he left. He admitted he had known he should not be driving. He apologized to Cassidy, to me, and to our parents. Then he said he understood that being scared did not excuse what he had done. I believed him more, in that moment, than I had believed most of his earlier explanations. It did not change my statement. The legal result was serious without becoming the fantasy punishment some relatives had imagined or the catastrophe my parents had predicted. Jason's felony conviction reflected the great bodily harm and his decision to leave the scene. The court imposed a sentence with a stayed prison term and conditions that included local confinement and supervised probation. The driving while suspended offense remained part of the disposition as well. Financial responsibility connected to the harm, insurance, and the separate civil side would continue beyond that morning. Jason did not walk out untouched. He also was not erased from the world. For the first time I could remember, a consequence reached him and stayed attached to his name. After the hearing, Mom and Dad went to Jason. I stood near the hallway wall with the victim services coordinator while people moved around us. Dad glanced toward me once. Mom did not come over. There was a time when that would have been the injury I carried home. I would have wondered what sentence I should have removed from my statement so she might cross the hall and choose me too. I did not wonder that now. I watched Dad place a hand on Jason's shoulder. Mom stood on Jason's other side. They looked like what they were, parents with a son they loved, who had done something serious, and now had to live with the result. I could let that be true without volunteering to make it easier. I left before they did. Cassidy was at home with a trusted family friend for the few hours I was gone. When I opened the front door, she was on the couch under a blanket, doing a word puzzle on her tablet, and complaining that the app had rejected a spelling she insisted should count emotionally. She looked up at me. Done? Done. She studied my face for a moment, then moved her feet so I could sit beside her. She did not ask what sentence Jason received. Not then. I did not force the information into the room. For the next few weeks, our lives became quieter. Not normal. I had stopped believing normal was a place we could return to, but quieter. Cassidy moved from the walker towards shorter stretches with less support. Some days she could read for half an hour. Some days 15 minutes gave her a headache. She still avoided the crosswalk nearest our house whenever there was another reasonable route. Mom and Dad did not call. I stopped checking whether they would. That may have been the strangest change of all. For years, so much of my relationship with them had happened before they ever said anything. I anticipated disappointment. I made myself easy. I adjusted plans. I answered okay. I had built an entire emotional life around making sure they never had to choose between Jason and me because I already knew which choice hurt less if I made it for them. After sentencing, there was nothing left for me to preempt. They had chosen their place beside him. I had chosen mine beside Cassidy. Neither fact required another argument. Then, one cold afternoon several weeks later, Cassidy was sitting at our kitchen table, working through an online school assignment, when my phone buzzed beside a mug of coffee. Mom's name appeared on the screen. It was the first message she had sent me since the hearing. I did not open it immediately. Cassidy noticed the name. I tapped the message. "We want to see our granddaughter." Cassidy read it from where she sat. Then she looked at me. Cassidy looked at me, then back at the message on my phone. "We want to see our granddaughter." For years, a sentence like that would have activated me before I even decided what I thought. I would have heard the need inside it, pictured Mom waiting for an answer. Imagined Dad telling her I was being stubborn, and started searching for the response that would make the most people feel better. I would have turned the problem into logistics. Maybe a short visit, maybe a neutral place. Maybe I could sit between them and make sure nobody said anything terrible. My mind began building those arrangements automatically, the way a hand reaches for a light switch in a familiar room. Then, I looked at Cassidy. She was still at the kitchen table in the loose gray sweatshirt she had once declared a traitor in rehab. Her laptop was open to a school assignment. A heating pad rested against her hip, because cold weather made the healing fractures ache more. She had been home only a few weeks. Some mornings she walked around the house without the walker. On harder days, especially after therapy, she used it again rather than spend all her energy proving she did not need it. Her headaches came less often than they had in rehab, but too much screen time could still bring one on. If 3 people spoke at once, I sometimes saw her face go blank with the effort of sorting voices. Nothing about her recovery said she needed to become the place where the rest of the family repaired itself. I put the phone down between us. "You don't have to answer that today." Cassidy stared at the coffee mug beside it. "Do I have to answer it ever?" "No." She looked relieved for half a second, then guilty for being relieved. I knew that expression because I had worn some version of it most of my life. I told her there were more choices than yes or no forever. She could want no visit now and feel differently later. She could want a text but not a visit. She could decide she did not want contact for a long time. She could change her mind in either direction. None of those choices required her to prove that Grandma and Grandpa were bad people. None required her to decide whether they loved her. The only question I wanted her to answer was what felt manageable and safe for her now. Cassidy rubbed one thumb along the edge of her laptop. "I don't want them here." "Our house." She meant our house. I waited. "Not yet," she added. "Maybe not for a while." That was the answer. I did not ask her to soften it. I did not say they were getting older, that Mom felt guilty, that Dad had always been good to her in other ways, or that one day she might regret not giving them a chance. Those thoughts existed. Some were even reasonable. But reasonable thoughts can still become pressure when they are handed to the most vulnerable person in the room. I told Cassidy I would take care of the response. Mom sent another message, before I had decided whether to text or call. She wrote that they were not asking to discuss the case. They only wanted to see Cassidy, tell her they loved her, and begin healing as a family. A minute later, another message arrived. We are still her grandparents. That sentence reached for an old rule. Blood meant access. Love meant access. Regret meant access. Family meant that the door could close temporarily but not remain closed if the person outside was related to you. I could feel how deeply I had once believed that. I called Mom because I did not want Cassidy reading a long argument over my shoulder. She answered immediately. Her voice was controlled, but I could hear how much she had been waiting for the call. Dad was with her. I knew because she put the phone on speaker after I asked. I told them Cassidy was not ready for a visit. Mom exhaled sharply. Dad asked whether that was Cassidy's decision or mine. The question would once have pulled me into a defense. I would have described our conversation in detail, so they would believe I had not manipulated her. Instead, I told them the truth without offering Cassidy's private thoughts as evidence. It's the decision for now. Mom said they had not seen their granddaughter since before the crash. She said they had missed the hospital, and she knew that could never be undone, but keeping them away now would not fix it. Dad said enough time had passed, that everyone needed to start figuring out what a family looked like after something terrible. I understood both arguments. That did not make either one a key to my front door. I told them this was not a punishment schedule. There was no number of weeks they could wait and then earn a visit automatically. Cassidy's recovery had already required her to surrender control over too much of her life: when to sleep, when to stand, when to stop, when to let strangers test her memory, when to use a walker, when to rest. I was not going to take control of this decision away from her because adults were uncomfortable. Mom's voice broke when she said, "But we love her." I know. That was the hardest answer I could have given because it left no villain for either of us to fight. They loved her. They had also failed her. Both could remain true. Dad said they deserved a chance to apologize to her directly. I told him an apology was supposed to be for the person receiving it, not the person who needed relief from giving it. If Cassidy wanted to hear one later, we could talk about how. Right now, she did not want to visit. There was silence on the line. Then Mom said, "She's our granddaughter, Megan." I looked toward the kitchen. Cassidy had put on headphones and returned to her assignment, one knee bouncing lightly under the table the way it always had when she concentrated. "I know who she is," I said. "That's why I'm listening to her." I did not give a speech after that. I did not threaten permanent estrangement. I did not tell them they would never see Cassidy again. I simply said there would be no visit now. If that changed, it would be because Cassidy wanted contact, and we believed it was safe for her, not because blood created a deadline. Dad sounded angry. Mom sounded wounded. Neither reaction changed the answer. When I hung up, my hands were shaking. That surprised me. I had imagined boundaries would feel powerful once I finally learned how to hold them. Sometimes they did not. Sometimes they felt like standing in a doorway, while people you loved told you that opening it would be easier for everyone. The strength was not in feeling certain. It was in not making Cassidy pay for my uncertainty. Life kept moving. By late winter, the crash was no longer the first subject of every morning, but it was still present in the architecture of our days. Cassidy had outpatient physical therapy twice a week, cognitive work less often than before, and follow-up appointments that seemed to reproduce whenever I crossed one off the calendar. She returned to school gradually, rather than all at once. At first, she did short blocks from home. Then she went in for part of the day with accommodations. A full day could still flatten her. Some nights she came home, ate half a sandwich, and slept until I woke her for medication. Her walking improved. So did her balance. The walker spent more time folded by the entryway, but I learned not to measure progress by whether it disappeared completely. On icy days, she used more support. After a hard therapy session, she sometimes limped. Her hip and leg could ache after too much activity. The brain injury was less visible and, in some ways, more unpredictable. She could joke through breakfast and then lose a familiar word while telling me where she had put a charger. She hated that more than pain. We learned not to turn bad afternoons into predictions about the future. A bad afternoon was a bad afternoon. A good one was good without becoming a promise. Jason's legal consequences moved on a separate track. He served the local confinement the court had ordered and entered supervised probation under the sentence already imposed. The suspended license matter did not vanish because the larger felony had taken most of the attention. Financial and insurance consequences continued as well, and the civil side moved at the slow speed civil matters often do. I stopped asking for updates unless something directly affected Cassidy. There was no satisfaction in imagining Jason having a hard day. I had never wanted suffering for its own sake. What mattered was that his hard day was no longer automatically assigned to someone else to fix. I kept the second letter he had sent me before sentencing in a drawer with other case papers. I did not show it to Cassidy. She knew he had apologized, and knew she could read the letter someday if she wanted. So far, she did not want to. I stopped asking myself whether that was fair to Jason. Fairness did not require turning his remorse into an appointment on Cassidy's calendar. Mom and Dad continued living in the same house. Teddy was still there. I knew that from the family group chat, which slowly returned to ordinary life in the strange way families do. A cousin posted a photo from Christmas, showing Teddy in a red bandana near my parents' tree. Mom was visible in the background carrying a plate. Dad had apparently repaired the broken deck step he had complained about for 2 summers. They had grocery runs, vet appointments, neighbors, bills, television shows, weather to complain about. Their lives had not collapsed into symbolic punishment. I was glad they had not. The consequence that mattered was quieter. They no longer had automatic access to Cassidy. They no longer received medical updates because they expected them. They received only what Cassidy was comfortable sharing. They no longer decided that a family holiday meant we would appear. The first time Mom asked whether we would come for dinner, I asked Cassidy instead of checking my mother's disappointment first. Cassidy said no. We stayed home, made too much pasta, and watched a movie she fell asleep halfway through. Nothing exploded. Saying no did not create the disaster I had always imagined. Sometimes it only meant someone else was unhappy, and all of us survived that. Mom tried again, a few weeks after the first request to see Cassidy. This time she asked whether Cassidy might accept a text directly from her. I did not answer for Cassidy. I asked. Cassidy thought about it overnight. The next morning she said, "She can text me. I might not answer." I told Mom exactly that. Her first message to Cassidy was short. She said she loved her, was sorry for not coming to the hospital when I called, and understood Cassidy did not owe her an immediate response. I knew about it only because Cassidy showed me. There was no defense of the party in the message. No mention of Jason. No request to forgive. Cassidy read it once and put her phone down. She did not answer that day. 2 days later, she sent a single line. "I got your message." Mom did not use the opening to push for a visit. I noticed it without turning one better choice into proof that everything had changed. Dad had a harder time with the uncertainty. He preferred plans, dates, steps. He asked once whether there was a point when a visit could be reconsidered. I told him, yes, the point when Cassidy wanted to reconsider it. He did not like an answer without a calendar. For once, his dislike did not become my project. The strangest part of those months was discovering how much space appeared when I stopped managing everyone's relationship to everyone else. I had spent years as the quiet connection between Mom's feelings, Dad's logistics, Jason's emergencies, and whatever I could absorb. When I stopped doing that, silence appeared where labor used to be. At first, the silence felt like failure. Then it began to feel like room, and Cassidy filled some of it. She started caring about school again in pieces. She got furious over a history assignment she thought was pointless. She changed the wallpaper on her phone 3 times in 1 week. She asked if she could invite a friend over, then needed a nap, 20 minutes before the friend arrived, and almost canceled. She learned that recovery did not ask permission before embarrassing her. I learned to help without making help feel like ownership. One Saturday, she came downstairs carrying the walker but not using it. "Why are you carrying that?" I asked. "In case I need it." "That seems sensible." She narrowed her eyes. "You're not supposed to sound surprised." "I'm not surprised. You had the face." I laughed because months earlier she had accused me of the same thing beside the rehab bars. There were things the crash had taken that I could not name yet. There were also things it had revealed that I wished I had learned another way. One of them was that care and control are not the same thing. Another was that protection can become harmful when it exists only to prevent the person you love from experiencing consequences. I had watched my parents confuse those things with Jason for years. I was determined not to repeat the mistake with Cassidy, in the opposite direction. Protecting her did not mean deciding every future relationship for her. It meant making sure guilt, obligation, and adult need did not decide before she had a voice. By early spring, her physical therapist began talking about practicing more real-world walking instead of only controlled indoor work. Cassidy had already crossed quiet parking lot lanes with supervision. Streets were harder. She still avoided the intersection nearest our house when another route was available. Nobody forced exposure for the sake of a dramatic milestone. Her therapist helped her break it into smaller pieces. One afternoon after an appointment, Cassidy asked if we could walk to the small pharmacy near our neighborhood instead of driving home. The route included a signalized crosswalk, not the one where she had been hit, still a crosswalk. The snowbanks had shrunk into gray piles along the curb. Meltwater ran in thin lines toward the drains. The air was cold enough that I could see my breath, but the light had changed in that unmistakable Minnesota way that promised winter would eventually lose. We walked slowly. Cassidy did not use the walker. She had a folding cane with her because her leg tired unpredictably, but she kept it in one hand without leaning on it much. I matched her pace without making a show of slowing down. When we reached the intersection, the pedestrian signal was red. Cassidy stopped several feet back from the curb. I stopped beside her. Cars moved through the intersection. Tires hissed over wet pavement. One driver accelerated a little too fast through a yellow light. I felt Cassidy's shoulder tighten next to mine. I wanted to say something reassuring. I wanted to tell her the light would change. The cars would stop. I was right there. We could go back if she wanted. All of those things were true. I kept them until she asked. The signal changed. The white walking figure appeared. Cassidy did not move. Neither did I. The countdown began. 8, 7, 6. A car waited at the turn. Cassidy watched it. 5, 4. Then the signal changed before we had stepped off the curb. I expected frustration. Instead, she breathed out and said, "Okay." We waited for the next cycle. I did not tell her she had almost done it. I did not tell her she had to do it this time. I did not tell her how proud I was. The second white figure appeared. Cassidy looked left, then right, then at the turning lane again. Her breathing slowed. She shifted the cane to her other hand. And then she stepped off the curb. I stepped with her. Halfway across, her hand brushed my sleeve. She did not grab me. I did not take her arm. We reached the other side before the countdown ended, and Cassidy stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking back at the street. "That sucked," she said. I laughed. "Want to go home?" She looked toward the pharmacy. "No, I want shampoo." So we kept walking. Cassidy still had therapy the next week and would still have bad days. My parents were still my parents. Jason was still my brother. Love had not erased harm, and accountability had not erased love. What had changed was where I drew the line. I could not undo the night Jason drove or the hours my parents chose uncertainty because it protected him better than Cassidy. I could only stop passing the cost forward. Cassidy would not visit, forgive, or carry anyone's remorse just to make the adults around her feel better. At the next corner, Cassidy slowed, checked the traffic, and waited. I waited beside her. When she was ready, she stepped. The consequence stopped moving here.